Morning is a slow rise today. Is a slow rise today. I hope everybody is doing wonderful. As I get started, good morning, Lourdes. I want to try and make sure that I get this shared out to everybody before we go. It's always weird to me to try and figure out which ones I'm missing and not share things twice on the same. So if I share things twice in the same thing, I apologize. It's not intentional. Some days my brain works and some days it doesn't, and some days this thing works for me and some days it doesn't, because yeah, that's just life, right? Like I feel some days like my brain is discombobulated completely, right? Like just can I function? And I'm only been up for a little bit, which is fine. I've been working really hard on trying to become more functional because it's been a while. Going through a lot of mental health therapy and a lot of work on self because of all the of what, Trotty? Of what? What are we jealous of? Good morning, love. No, I said I've been going through a lot of therapy. Honey, you gotta open your ears. You gotta learn to listen. I'm a war vet, and so I actually do a lot of therapy through the VA because I have severe trauma from Iraq and severe trauma from Blue Falcons, and so I spent. And then of course, like I frontline on this side. Like I've stood up on this side a few times because I took that oath of protect against all enemies, foreign and domestic, very seriously. And so I was in Standing Rock, and then I was in Portland. I was already in Portland in 2020, and so I spent all of 2020 on the streets, really. So with all that trauma, my brain doesn't work sometimes. And one thing about me is that because of the way, yes, we did, because of the way that I'm a very verbose human being. I've always had an extensive like vocabulary. I've always been an orator, a storyteller, a historian, and so because of that, words are the way that my mind works when my PTSD is bad, when my complex PTSD is bad, and when I have military sexual trauma PTSD as well. And so when all of that gets really, really bad, my words drop and my words will shift and change. Like I will mean to say purple and I'll say green, or I'll mean to say birth and I'll say death. Like my brain will flip the words in my brain and I'll say a completely opposite word of what I'm trying to say. And I don't like being irritable, and I don't like being. I'm not an angry person. My first bouts of anger were actually in basic training. Like I had never been angry before basic training. I'd been hurt and I'd been frustrated, but I had never been like see red or like pissed off or like any of that kind of stuff before basic training. And so I my PTSD will make me really frustrated and angry, and I get short and I get irritable. And so I try very hard to control that stuff. And so I went through I've gone through a lot of therapy, and we didn't find out that I was ADD until I was 42. And so I've been on medication for the ADD for the last couple of years, and it's helped in a lot of things. But then I realized that I've always been chronically depressed. Like I have chronic depression and have since I was a teenager. And so I realized that a part of this shit that I was dealing with was also the chronic depression, which is why people are like, well, can you do like weekly lives, or can you do like this, or you can do like that? And I'm like, no, I can't do anything that obligates me to anybody else. I can't work because it obligates me to somebody else. And because the working for somebody else puts somebody else in control of me, and I can't put another human being in control of me ever again. Like that's just not okay for my brain because of the trauma that I've gone through. And so just starting some antidepressants so that I can start to be a little bit more functional because there are things that I want to do, right? Like I've accomplished a lot in the last year. Like I've written 2 books and I've published 2 books in the last year and been doing lives and I've been doing a lot of other stuff in my personal life. And yet I want to be able to like have these. I've never been anybody's woman. But cute. I don't even know who you are. Uh, I mean, I might. I never know because of usernames, but like, you know. Um, so uh, they finally, I'm getting on antidepressants as well, so that maybe I can start functioning. And like, I want, like, I'll like plan. I'm going to wake up and I'm going to do these things and I'm going to do those things and I'm going to have this done and I'm going to work on this. I'm going to work on that. And I wake up and I'm like, no, I'll video game and day all day instead. Like, no, I'll just sit on my couch and you do nothing all day instead. And so I'm trying to get a thing, like a role where I'm like able, not a role, but like on a role where I'm able to like actually like do the function that I want to do, plan it out and actually function for self. And so that's what I'm working on. And so I'm working on making sure that I'm coming in and doing more lives on a regular basis so that I can get the functions, so that I can do the things, so that I can be the things that I want to do. Right. And so I'm kind of working on that. And that's why I'm like, okay, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to go do a live today. And I'm here and I did it and I'm functioning, which is really, really nice. I have a nesting partner. I'm poly. I do have a nesting partner who happens to identify as male. Um, we argue frequently over which one of us is more badass. I am a war vet again, and I've stood front lines here on this side. And they're an MMA champion, like they have belts. There's a belt in my living room, and so we constantly argue over which one of us is more badass. That's our relationship. When I met their siblings, actually, their sister, I met them, and we ended up going to Memphis, and we were on Beale Street in Memphis, and we went into a shop, and their sister found a pair of socks that said I identify as badass. And yeah, you'd really like Jay. Jay is one of those human beings that he's so laid back and so gregarious and so sweet and just so loving and embracing. You'd probably, I've never met a person that didn't. Um, but they bought me a pair of socks. His sister bought me a pair of socks that says I identify as badass because in her first meeting of me and Jay were sitting on the couch in their father's house, and she was asking me questions about myself, and I'm like, this, I'm a badass. Jay's like, I'm the badass, and I'm like, no, I'm the badass. So we're sitting here having the argument. So she got me socks that says I identify as badass. So my partner is a pretty badass human being. We'll probably eventually, legalize it so that we can, use that legalization for the VA loans and stuff and buy a house. But I'm not sure. A legalization is just really one of those things that's about the government and what they need more than it is anything else. So, I can see partner is much better to me than husband. I've had 2 of those and they both sucked ass. But my husband's were pains. So, um, we've been talking extensively about some in-depth European history, right? And some going back, but we haven't really been talking a lot about the different things that we can do to try and find that connection. I've touched on it once or twice, but I thought today let's go ahead and discuss a few different things that you can do to connect to your European ancestry without culturally appropriating from other ancestries. Hello, beautiful one. So I wanted to go ahead and touch on those. Atira, do you go live every night? Because I can come in some nights. I have to go to specific spaces to be able to go live. Like I have to be in my office to go live because the internet in my house and my phone internet in my house really sucks. So if you're going live every night, I'll try and come in. Okay, so I'll try and come in and actually be able to come in and sit in a live and actually come up on a live for you within the next couple of days because I can come in and sit in my office and then at night I I can't, like, if I'm doing anything else and just listening to lives, like last night I was trying to just listen to other people, and if I'm doing anything else and just listening, I'm usually in the other room, or if I'm moving around, it becomes hard for me. So I I'll try and come in so that I can come in. I want to try and do a couple panels. I know that there's a couple of people who've been wanting. Nice. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I know there's a couple of people, and I have some questions actually. My siblings, my sister, she can trace, but she like, and it's her grandmother. Like, her grandmother was enrolled federally, and so they're trying to prevent my nephew from losing his children, and so we want to take a look at that. And I'm trying to figure out how to get her the ability to enroll, because I know that they. I mean, I've seen their tracing, and I know they know who their grandmother is and everything else. And so if we can, I want to get some information on that for her, because I promised her I'd see what I can find out on that, as well as the other stuff that I know that you're doing. Yeah. Yeah, and I know you are, and that's why I was like, I need to go and talk to Tara about this, because I know that you would know how to get her. Um, I think the base thing that she needs is she needs to be enrolled. Like, her grandmother was enrolled, but I don't think her mother was enrolled because some. I think her mother. I don't think I don't think that her mother was ever lost. Like, I remember from stories. I mean, I remember her grandmother growing up, and so I don't think my mama Kay was ever, like, taken or anything, but I know that there's something in it, and so I wanna see what we can do for her. Um, this today, we're talking about, European ancestry, and today, instead of focusing on uh, today, instead of focusing so much on the deep past, like 40,000 to 30,000 years ago, which is who the person behind me is. This is a Gravachian man behind me, and they would have been 40,000 to 30,000 years ago. We'll touch on some of that a little bit. I also want to touch a little bit on different things that you can do to reconnect to your ancestry of European descent, without appropriating culture. That's part of the reason that I come in, and part of the reason that I'm doing some of the things that I'm doing is to try and help people of European descent, to connect and to decolonize, and to find their ancestry and find the indigenous lifeways of their indigenous ancestors. That does not mean belonging to one of the current indigenous groups that are there, because unless you have that connection in that blood, you can't, right? Um, so I for many people who are accomplices, there's a difference between appreciation and appropriation. There is a huge difference between appreciation and appropriation. We'll touch on that a little bit today too. Um, for many people who are allies and accomplices here within the United States, whether it's allies and accomplices to Land Back, or allies and accomplices to Black Lives Matter, or just allies and accomplices to the idea of removing the hate and the racism in the system, and helping people, right? Many people who are of European pure descent, are purely European descent, in that space, who are allies and accomplices, are trying to reconnect and trying to, find their own ancestry and trying to decolonize without appropriating culture. And so uh, you can excuse it any way you want to make it comfortable for you to harm people. You can excuse anything you want to in any way you want to make it comfortable for you to harm people, but that does not ever make it right. And I need you to understand that. Whatever excuses that you want to use, you were conquered, you were colonized, get over it. Y'all hurt each other too. It's appreciation, not appropriation. Whatever excuse you need to use in your brain to, justify the atrocities that you or your ancestors committed in your own fucking brain, you go right ahead. Don't do it in my space. That's a moral and ethical failing that you have, and I don't need to deal with it, especially at 8 o'clock in the fucking morning. Just saying. If that's how you feel, and you're not here to learn, and you're here to tell everybody how you have the right to harm people, scroll the fuck on. So, a lot of allies and accomplices are really looking for ways to appreciate culture, and to find their own culture and their own heritage, and to reconnect to their own spaces and their own indigenous lifeways without appropriating culture. And so that's one of the things that I come into TikTok to do. One of those things that I work on really hard, right? One of those things that I've been asked by my family members, by my communities, to do so that people have the ability to do that and to be healthier in the way that they're doing that. Let us go ahead though and touch on appreciation versus appropriation first, because that's something that came up. Um, if you have a friend who's an Indigenous creator, or you know somebody who's an Indigenous creator, and you are buying earrings from them, right? You're buying. Why are you awake?
What are you doing? Can you talk in your live?
I can talk to you and talk in my live too. I was just telling my live what a wonderful human being you were. So, it's okay. I mean, I wouldn't come in your chonies, but
That's fine.
um, so, right? I mean, he's cute in his chonies, but still, right? Nobody needs to see that. But appreciation versus appropriation. So let me show you a couple things really quick. So I am, and I state this frequently, I am Turtle Island Indigenous by ancestry and by raising. I am not enrolled. I'm not a member of a nation. I'm not claimed, and I'm okay with that. I'm not seeking, my ancestry isn't about what money I can make from it, right? If you are appreciating a culture, there are a lot of creators out there, right, who are making beautiful things. This is an earring that was made by a creator, Makwa. She's on my Facebook. I actually need to do a video of all the people that I have earrings from, because I have a bunch of beautiful earrings. This earring is really cool. Like, you can see in the middle of it, this is Bernie at the 2020 inauguration. When he's sitting there with his hands in his lap and his big old mittens on and his little like packet of something, right, in the center. And around it, you can see, if I hold it up really close, this is a braided sweetgrass, right? And she's got beautiful stones around. Makwa is, she's in coastal Salish territory. I cannot remember all of her nations. And she's a traditional tattooist, or they are a traditional tattooist. And they are also, they do a lot of jewelry making. Buying and wearing jewelry or tattoos or different things from Indigenous people is not cultural appropriation. It is cultural appreciation. If you were to make your own, this is mine. I learned to be very young, right? I don't make and sell Indigenous stuff, right? I just don't. I don't like selling things anyways. It makes it harder for me to make them. This is one that I made. This is a brick stitch beadwork. This is ancestry for me. This is all my relations earrings is mine. And so I, can, as an Indigenous person, of course, make things that are, representative of Indigenous things. You can bead your own earrings and not be an Indigenous person. And in beading your own earrings and not being an Indigenous person, you can bead in the Russian style, or you can bead. There's beading is global, like it's everywhere. It's like 70, 80, 120,000 years old. Beading is global, right? So you can bead and do things that are not native inspired, right? And create things and sell those things, right? Yet if you're not Indigenous, you would not want to create Indigenous inspired or native inspired earrings or styles and patterns that are made by Indigenous people and sell them as Indigenous designs. That is appropriation. You can appreciate by, take gifts. These are a pair of earrings that I actually got in Standing Rock. These are from I call her sometimes my sister wife, but my wifey in Standing Rock, Kwani, is beautiful, beautiful human being. And she gave me these in Standing Rock. Somebody gifted her a bunch of earrings, and these are the pair that she gave me, and I've had them since then, right? So this is appreciation. If I was a white human being, though I am not a white human being, it would be completely appropriate for me to buy earrings from Indigenous creators and wear earrings from Indigenous creators. This is appreciating their culture, and this is uplifting their culture. This is giving people sometimes the ability to eat. This is giving people sometimes the ability to pay bills, for their children to maybe have Christmas presents, or to be okay. Because many times, many of our Indigenous people in this country are the poorest people in our country, right? The Standing Rock, or not Standing Rock, Pine Ridge is considered like the poorest area of the country, right? It's extremely destitute, right? So when you are buying from indigenous people, indigenous work, this is cultural appreciation. This is uplifting culture, right? Now, if you buy it, if I bought Makwa's earrings and went around wearing Makwa's earrings and everybody said, "Those are gorgeous earrings. Where'd you get those?" And I went, "Oh, I made them." That is appropriation. Buying something and claiming that it's yours is absolutely appropriation, right? But if you were, um, I'm going by statistically, Joshua, and I have been all around this country. And Pine Ridge is actually like recognized as the poorest part of our country. That reservation, because of the way it has been treated, because of the fact that they fought on and on and on, is recognized as the poorest part of our country on a like national scale. Like that's it is worse than Detroit. It is worse than Flint. And it is. And I've been to them. I've been to them and it is. Now, that doesn't mean that the people within that space aren't doing their best to make it better, right? What it means is that because of the way it's been treated, it is much worse. Okay. So you can argue it all you want, but the facts stand. So if you're buying from indigenous people and wearing indigenous items that you bought from indigenous people, that is cultural appreciation. I have these beautiful earrings. I got them from Makwa. She's such an amazing creator. Let me direct you to her. That is cultural appreciation. That helps Makwa. That helps me wear beautiful things. And it helps somebody else find Makwa, right? So when we are appreciating culture, we're going to the people whose culture it is and we're buying from them. I have a pair of shoes that I have that are like little, they're from India and they're the little kind of slippery shoes. I bought them so that I could wear them for a Halloween costume because they have feathers on them. And I was doing um, Hera for Halloween, right? They have peacock feathers and they're gorgeous. And I wear them all the time. They're velvet, they're beautiful. This is something that I went and I found a creator in India and I bought a pair of shoes from a creator in India because those shoes worked for what I needed, right? And when I wear them, I direct people to where I got them from. I show people the way to find them. This is appreciation of culture. Appropriation of culture would be if I were to make things, and again, if I was a white woman instead of just looking like a white woman, if I was a white woman and I was to say make these earrings that I have made, or actually, let me show you one other set that I have. I don't usually make to sell, but when I was making a lot, I uh, uh, I make red dress earrings, or I did for a while there, and I was making and gifting, and to kind of stop myself from having a back order of gifts because people were asking, I did start charging a little bit, and then all of the money that I got from it went to the local MMIW branches that we have. So these are a pair of earrings that I made that are jingle dress dancers. This is dentilium. This is a shell that is indigenous here in Turtle Island, and it is well, known among indigenous communities. This is my little jingle dress that I made. Right now, if I was a whole ass white woman, which again I'm not, and I were to make these things and I were to sell these things and profit off of these things, that would be a cultural appropriation. And in this case, it would be taking something that is extremely important because red dresses are something that we use to symbolize what is going on with MMIW and how we're losing 26% per capita of our women and children. And so, if as a non Indigenous woman, again, I am not, but if I was and I were to make red dresses and I were to sell them, this design is specific to Indigenous people. This design is specific for something, and that would be cultural appropriation. So, this is where we get the difference of cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. Braids are a global thing. We've all worn braids longer than we had an understanding. We were all wearing braids before Neanderthal died. Braids are a global thing. Specific braid patterns are specific to the slave trade within the United States, and this is because they were used to create knowledge right? Some of them were used as maps. Some of them were used for hiding things so that they could be safe. So wearing specific braid patterns in your hair would be cultural appropriation. Whereas if you were to say, go to somebody who braids hair and uh, I know women who braid hair who need practice, right? And I've had people say, listen, I need practice on braiding on something that's not tightly coiled. Can I use your hair and put braids in your hair? Yep, you can do that. So I wore box braids for, I think, the month of my daughter's wedding. And that was because my sibling was like, she was in school. She was trying to practice how to do braids in hair that was not tightly coiled. And she's like, can I use your hair? Absolutely, you can use your hair, my hair. That is not appropriation, right? That is appreciation. Even if box braids are something that is purely of Black descent, right? And they're not. They are definitely something that goes along through different places. We actually see the earliest documentation of braiding hair into our hair comes from the Romans, right? So this is where we look at appreciation versus appropriation, right? Appreciation is I see an indigenous creator, I see a Black creator, and I am buying stuff that they're making, right? I am supporting their livelihood, right? And I am appreciative of it. I wear the things that I got. Google is free, and they did not. But that's nice for you to think so. You could have been kings, and that's great. In Turtle Island, there weren't a lot of kings, right? There just weren't. So you can have been that, and that's kind of cool for you, right? I mean, there were a lot of kings in Africa, and there are a lot of kings in Europe, and there are a lot of kings in Asia, and totally on that, right? But nah, right? Like that's not something we really had here. That's why the whole Cherokee princess thing laughs, right? Because we didn't have kings and queens, right? No, actually, braids are a global thing. So again, the person behind me, this person is European, 30 to 40,000 years ago. We all start, like the whole species starts dark, right? The whole species starts in Africa, anyways. If you don't know, when you're braiding hair, unless it's tightly coiled hair, you can't really so I can't just tie my hair back until I get rubber bands. I can't take a piece of leather and just tie back ultra straight hair. I actually have to braid leather into my hair and tie it off. Um, we see that braids really, I mean, there's micro braids and dreadlocks in Turtle Island and in Abiyala, and they are in ultra straight hair, right? These things are really across the globe. There are a lot of different things that are across the globe. Tattooing, our first tools for tattooing are found in France, right? Painting our bodies, this goes back to the Neanderthals. These things really go across the globe, right? I didn't say I was Cherokee. I said that's why the word Cherokee princess or the phrase Cherokee princess or my grandmother was a Cherokee princess is laughable because we didn't have kings. That was the whole statement, right? So, um, when we are looking at the when we are looking at the way that things are moving across the globe, right? We see that many things are much older than we like to think of, right? And when we're looking at the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation, right? Because this is where this particular conversation starts with. When we're looking at cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation, when somebody buys things from an indigenous designer, when somebody goes to somebody who's Black to buy things, um, these things are considered cultural appreciation, right? Again, if I were to go to a creator and buy things from them based on their culture and wear those things based on their culture because I have spent money and given money to somebody of that culture to wear those things, this is uplifting that culture. This is helping that culture. This is appreciation. If I were to go and create things from that culture and not belong to that culture and state that I belong to that culture or state that I am creating these things inspired by that culture and then sell them myself, this is cultural appropriation. Okay. So you can absolutely go and buy indigenous earrings from indigenous creators and wear indigenous earrings or indigenous designs from indigenous creators. You can absolutely go to a Black woman who is braiding hair, who wants to practice on your hair, or who you're paying to, and get your hair braided. These things are appreciation of culture versus appropriation of culture. Appropriation of culture is to profit from it, right? And appropriation in culture is to wear things um, that might get somebody else killed that you didn't get from the somebody else, right? So like um, the chin line that we see going around TikTok all the time, right? We see, well, I'm explaining to Europeans. So if I should be explaining to anybody, that should be exactly what I'm explaining, right? I'm not explaining to people of Black or Indigenous culture. As an Indigenous woman who descends from a Black woman, I'm not explaining Black and Indigenous culture to people. I'm explaining how not to be a shit ass with Black and Indigenous culture and how to appreciate other cultures. And then we're going into how to find your own. So if you think I'm white splaining, which is not what's going on, because I'm not fucking white, whether you think I am or not, because of your perception, nah. And I'm talking specifically to those of indigenous or of European ancestry, how to be better towards people of other ancestry. So if it sounds like I'm making it sound like they can understand it, maybe that's why, boo. So when we are looking at the difference between appropriation and appreciation, that is a very huge understanding that a lot of people don't have. You'll see a lot of people who are sitting here going, I don't feel like I can wear earrings that Indigenous people created because I'm a feeling that that's cultural appropriation. That's not cultural appropriation. It would be cultural appropriation if you were to buy this earring from Makwa and then go and create this earring and copy this earring and then sell it as your own. That would be appropriation. Buying the earring from Makwa and wearing the earring that Makwa created is appreciation. Okay. So that is the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. And when we are talking in here today, what we're talking about is how to, as an ally or an accomplice to Indigenous and Black people, find your own ancestry so that you're not appropriating other people's culture. What things can you look at that are global or that are specific to Europe or are specific to ancestries that you have that you can incorporate in your life to bring connection to your ancestors without taking things from Indigenous culture? A lot of the times, the things that are specific to specific cultures have to do with patterns or specific ways of doing things. I don't know how many we have in here. I can turn them off if it's getting bad. I know that it might be. I think that we might only have like one person in here right now. Mia, are you the only? Is anybody else in here besides Mia who's a moderator? I've got Sava and Mia. Okay. Yeah, let me go ahead and I'm just going to do that for a little while because it is nasty and I did see that and I know that it's hard for many of you who are just in here to actually hear and to listen. Of course, I will turn these back on after a little while so that people can ask questions. And then also, I am over on YouTube. While the comments are off, I am over on YouTube. If you have questions that you want to ask, you can go over there and ask, right? I do keep an eye on it. And so it's like down below so you can see it. But we will keep them off because I do know that sometimes they get very troll heavy and really shitty. And I get distracted, which makes this whole thing a whole different situation, right? And I know that it becomes an unsafe space for people when people are being asshats in the comments, right? So I'll absolutely go ahead and we'll keep them off for a little while. If they get down low again, if we're low viewers again, we'll go ahead and turn them back on and see how we're at there. And if you need to ask questions before I turn the comments back on, I want to remind you that I am on YouTube. That is open for comments. You can go over there and ask questions. So again, and because I got started with answering a question before many people come in, let me go ahead as we're at like almost 200 people in the live, explain a couple of things. First of all, I'm Witta. I am an Indigenous Two-Spirit, globally mixed Indigenous Two-Spirit. I am an educator. I am a historian. I'm an anthropologist. I'm an archaeologist. I'm a healer. Okay. And I'll gladly give people my credentials. But Not in public. Like, that's just not something you dox yourself with, right? I mean, like, I'll do it in public, like around other people, but like, I'm not going to give you names right here so you can fuck with people. Um, I have studied extensively for 45 years with indigenous medicine first, and then became a medic in the medicine field. And I learned to read in history and archaeology works. And so, with that, I have an extensive knowledge of archaeology and anthropology and history. I have degrees in both fields. I don't work. I'm a military veteran, a war veteran, and I have a lot of trauma, and so I can't work. And so instead, what I do is I utilize my time to come in here and teach. What I'm giving is a basic level information. It is not advanced knowledge. It's not something you're going to get a college degree on. It does help some people in some college classes. I won't say not, but it's not for that. I have a website, which is right there. I compile bibliographies of articles that you can actually access on that website that are free so that you can get to the articles so that you can dig deeper. I firmly believe that you learn best when you're interested in the subject and when you set your own pace and you're learning at your own things, right? And so I'm not here to give you a broad scale information. I'm here to give you some basis so that you can dig deeper because I believe that that's how we learn. I believe that we should not have education gate kept behind a $40,000 a year paywall. And I believe it should not be gate kept behind huge words and verbose language that makes it hard for even people with extensive degrees and extensive vocabularies to understand. And so for me, I use this space because TikTok gives everybody with 1,000 followers their own space. I use this space to teach, to give information, to get education out there. My typical field and the things that I typically focus on are paleoanthropology, who we were before we were we, and I do teach a lot of European history and European prehistory. And this is because one of the reasons that I am here and doing this is because many people from my varied communities have asked me to teach accomplices and allies how to decolonize without culturally appropriating from other people. And so I am in here trying to teach those of European descent how to find their European ancestry without appropriating culture from other people, which is why we were touching on the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. Now, I have done extensive study, I have done extensive looking. I want to make sure that I'm not doing things that I shouldn't be doing. And that's why I did that. I got into this when at 12 years old, moving from one indigenous community onto a res, people were like, girl, you white, you ain't indigenous. And I went, okay. And they said, you can't be us. And I went, okay, I'm going to go find other indigenous history because I've always been indigenous, right? And so if you're not going to accept me in your community, I'm going to find other. And so I know what I know about European indigenous history because of my own study for my obviously European as well ancestry, right? I'm very globally mixed. It is everything across the globe. There's not a place or continent that my people are not from. That does mean that I will not teach you how to worship. I will not teach you the connections that you need because mine are so mixed that I can't point out to you half the time which ones are from Turtle Island, which ones are from Africa, which ones are from Europe, which ones are from Asia, which ones are from Australia. I can't point that out to you in my own personal practice. So I'm not going to teach you how to practice. I will, however, teach you how to find the things that you need to practice and teach you some of the things that archaeology and history teach us so that you can know some stuff. Now, I don't work very much in history because even though I have extensive knowledge of history and have been studying history for 40 odd years, I also know that history is biased and that history is not always correct. And so I go with the science. I'm a big evidence person, I'm a big science person. And because of that, I go with what I can see in archaeology and what I can see in the actual records instead of seeing it written down by somebody who probably was killing other people and writing down how great they were. The ones that they were writing down how great they were for killing other people, right? So I teach a lot of archaeology and anthropology and teach you how to use archaeology and anthropology to find some truths. We are focusing today on European ancestry, again, for that ability to decolonize without appropriating other culture. And we have been focused on the last couple of days over who the people were from the Gervasians, which is the man behind me, who are the first people in Europe without the Neanderthals there. The people who are moving in before the Gervasians, the Aleutians, are with the Neanderthals. They look like the Gervasians. We all start out in Africa as a species, and the species all starts out as black, though by the time, 1492 comes around, black is only in specific areas, and is not across the globe. Obviously, Europeans by that time had gotten pretty light, and Turtle Island indigenous people had gotten more copper. And these are people, actually, Turtle Island indigenous and Abiyalian indigenous people got here before people got to Europe, right? So Turtle Island indigenous people and Abiyalian indigenous people have been in their space longer than Europeans have. So by 40,000 years ago, there are people all over Turtle Island and Abiyala. I don't teach how to reconnect to Turtle Island Indigenous nations or how to find your ancestry in Turtle Island. I know many creators that do, and I can direct you to those creators, but that's not my lane. And I also don't teach culture for Turtle Island Indigenous people because, again, that is not my lane. Okay. I'm not a culture keeper. I'm not a culture keeper anywhere. I'm not choosing to be a culture keeper anywhere. That's that intersectionality in my live. When my comments are on, I have a few boundaries that I set, and that's a healthy thing, and I'm allowed to do that. Again, TikTok gives everybody with 1,000 followers a live. This is my space. TikTok said so. Whether you agree or not doesn't make a fucking difference. In my space, I don't deal very well with racism. Anthropology is the field that created the theory of race, and anthropology is the field that debunked the theory of race. Race does not exist. It is a colonial construct. Racism exists. Unfortunately, it's really bad. And fucking, we have entire countries built on a structure of racism, right? I live in one, right? And culture exists and ethnicity exists. And these are extremely important to very many people. Culture and ethnicity. This is why we get cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. So I don't deal with racism well. If you're going to be a racist asshat in my chat, you're not going to like my return. Okay. And I'm not saying you're being racist against me because, can't be racist against people who are white. And I look white as fuck. And so you're probably not being racist against me, even if you're saying nasty white ass shit. Because honestly, fucking I agree. Right. But you will not be racist in my chat and like the response. The other things that I don't deal with in my chat are phobias based on gender, desire, or religion. Don't want to hear about your God. He's a narcissist. He's nasty. Keep him out of my fucking chat. Yet I don't want to hear your Islamophobia or your anti-Semitism. Both of those are nasty as well. And I do not deal with phobia based on gender and desire either. There are 3 biological sexes, male, female, and intersex. Gender is a perception of self-identity, and you don't get to decide for another person how they self-fucking identify. What an egotistical thought process you have if you think you do. And you should not be deciding who fucks who. Nobody gave you that right. Get it out of my chat. So those are the rules and the constructed boundaries within my space and what I am doing here. And if you don't want it, you don't like it, that's okay. Nobody's making you stay. You can scroll on and find another person. You can get 1,000 followers and do a live. You can do 1,000 followers and do a live and go, Wit is a fucking bitch all over your live. And I'm going to be like, okay, bye boo, right? I don't care. I'm not here for that. I'm not here for the lateral violence. I'm not here for the hate. I am here to educate. I am here out of kindness and love. And I expect the same in return, which is a boundary as well. I am here because I love humanity and I'm tired of being scared of leaving my house because some of y'all mean. Okay. And I'm here to teach who we are because I have done extensive study to try and figure that out. And I think that I have some of an answer. Do I have the whole answer? Probably not. The other thing is if you think that I'm wrong, you're probably right. There's a lot of areas that I don't have all the information on, right? I might be right in what I have today, but there might be things that I haven't seen yet. There might be things that come out tomorrow that change everything, right? So if you think I'm wrong, I encourage you to let me know. I do not encourage you to tell me you're a liar or you're wrong. I encourage you to go, Witta, that information is incorrect. This information tells you that that information is incorrect. And then I can go and Google it. And then I can go and expand my knowledge because that's what we're here for, expansion of knowledge. Being narrow-minded and only understanding one thing is not healthy. That's not who we are as a species. Who we are as a species is so creative that we're the only species that adapts its adaptations, right? We are the only species that takes it from a home to a phone, okay? And because of that, change is necessary for us, creativity is necessary for us, and constantly seeking new information is necessary for us as a species. And so I'm never right all the time, right? I have things that I have facts so that I know I am absolutely right in this one today. Tomorrow I may be wrong. right? So if you have new information, give it to me. I'm down. Just don't be a shit ass about it. Tell me what it is, tell me where I'm wrong, and tell me why so that I can go and figure out, right? Otherwise, I'm just going to consider you a troll. And those are the boundaries and the rules in my chat. Right now, I do have it on subscribers only. Again, YouTube is where I'm also streaming. Absolutely, Tommy. And you can go over to YouTube and you can ask questions on YouTube or make comments on YouTube, and I can see them there. If you have questions to ask and you don't want to wait until I turn the comments back on, I will go ahead and turn the comments back on at some point so that everybody can have an opportunity to ask questions. But due to the request of how trolly it was getting and how nasty it was getting, I did decide to turn them off. Um, all of that said, let's go ahead and talk a little bit. Again, this is a Gravatian man, this human being behind me on the screen. I believe that this is a Thomas Borkland art piece. I cannot remember exactly, which is bad of me, and I know I need to go and figure it out. But this is I believe it's Thomas Borkland art piece. And this art piece is rendered as a male, but it was taken from the Gravatian goddesses that we have. We have the Venus of Willendorf and the Venus of Brahmsemphi, few other Venuses, but these are the two specific ones that this one is taken from. The Venus of Willendorf and the Venus of Brahmsemphi are ones that you probably know and you've probably seen, and they are from the Gravatian period in Europe. The Gravatian period in Europe is from about 40,000 years ago to about 30,000 years ago. It's a little bit rough. The people were already there. It is just a period of culture. It is not a period of genetics. So it is not that the people there before the Gravatian culture were an entirely different genetic group and the people after the Gravatian culture were a different genetic group. They're all the same genetic group. It's just the way that culture cycles through. Okay. So the Gravatian culture is the first culture that is in Europe without the presence of other humans, right? We as a species come from convergence. We're one of the two species that we know of on this planet that came from convergence. Up until last year, this was a theoretical method of speciation. Last year, between Homo erectus and Homo sapien, it was proven that this is no longer a theoretical method of speciation, that Homo erectus actually comes from convergence, and the species that we believe that Homo erectus comes from as a convergence is Paranthropus boisei. You probably saw in the news last year how he is the tool maker, the first of our tool makers, instead of it being Homo habilis as the first of our tool makers. Homo habilis being the other species that we come from. And then you'll all know the third one, that's Lucy, Australopithecines, right? Okay, so we believe now that Homo erectus is coming from a convergence of those three species. Now, Homo erectus was morphologically an extremely diverse species. There are many different what we call subspecies of Homo erectus, depending on which side of anthropology you're on this. And those are ones that you might know of as ergaster, Ancestry, heidelbergensis, and these are subspecies of Homo erectus. They're all found in the same groups. They all live together. And because they're all living together, they end up in a convergence of many of these species, creating Homo sapien in roughly 300,000 years ago. And the current knowledge is that Homo sapien is being created in Africa at 300,000 years ago out of a convergence. An ancestor and a Homo heidelbergensis have a child up in Morocco, and heidelbergensis and ergaster have a child in Ethiopia, and a heidelbergensis and erectus have a child in Johannesburg, right? And so these three are, your first and your earliest of Homo sapiens. Each group starts getting little groups of Homo sapien children. They all got erectus and ergaster and ancestor parents and grandparents, right? But they look like little Homo sapiens. And so you get a few little Homo sapiens here and a few little Homo sapiens here and a few little Homo sapiens here. This starts at 300,000 years ago. By 135 to 125,000 years ago, all those little pockets of Homo sapiens and all of these different bands of people converge into one species. And that's where we get our species Homo sapien. By 150,000 years ago, our species is already in the Levant area and mixing with the Neanderthals in the Levant area. Our species was never alone until recently. Our species, throughout the entire course of our prehistory, actually had several different other species of human beings that it was interacting with on a regular basis. So our species in prehistory does not have the idea that you look different, therefore you're bad. In fact, our species seems to think you look different, I want to fuck. That seems to be the way we roll. If you look different, I want sex with you because you look different and might get some differences there in my babies. This is something that our species seems to be really, really big on. And this is why we all have Neanderthal, except for two populations in Africa. Prior to colonization, those two populations, the Yoruba population and the Quake population, They have 3 ghost species in them. Everybody else on the planet has Neanderthal. Half the planet has Denisovan. And then there is ghost species in Turtle Island indigenous people, Aboriginal indigenous people, and Australian indigenous people. Ghost species, we see a little bit of them like Neanderthal and Denisovan in our genome, in our DNA, but we haven't found the species and their full genome in the fossil record yet. We haven't got DNA from a fossil of them yet. And so we call them ghost species. So we're looking at us moving across the globe, and as sapien is moving across the globe, it's enveloping these other species in it. Now, when we come in contact with Neanderthal, we're not fighting Neanderthal, we're not killing Neanderthal, we're fucking them, we're integrating with them. We're learning new things from them, and they're learning new things from us. And it is, in fact, this meeting that gives us burial, that gives us cave art, that gives us the identity of self that we have today. I am me, and you are you. The id, the basic conscious of self identity, right? So all of these things come from our interactions with other species on a healthy level, not on a fighting level. We do not have violence that is definitive in the archaeological record prior to 10,000 years ago. At 10,000 years ago, we go from 2,000 being our individuals that we have in the fossil record, 2% of them show things that could possibly be attributed to violence, i.e., or an explanation of, is if I see a skull that has been crushed by a rock, I cannot tell you if a human hand welded that rock, hit that skull, or a cave collapsed and hit that skull, or they're out in the middle of, a pass and something falls down, a rock slide hits that skull. I cannot tell you that, so it is not definitive violence. Yet, if I have one of our first things of definitive violence in Kenya at 10,000 years ago, and I see 8 people in a line, one of them is a heavily pregnant woman with her hands obviously bound underneath her stomach who has been hit by something sharp in the back of the head. This is obvious definitive violence. So prior to 10,000 years ago, we do not have definitive violence in the archaeological record. And the things that could possibly be attributed to violence are 2% of the 2,000 that we have. At 10,000 years ago, we start to see definitive violence in the archaeological record, like the Kenyan massacre, and we start to see that violence rise. And it goes from the 2% could possibly be attributed to 18 to 20% definitive violence. At this time period, at this timeline, we see a lot of things starting to shift. One of these things that starts to shift is we've been the only people that look like us that are human on the planet for about, well, at least 3,000 years. There's some belief that Denisovan was here until 13,000 years ago. So this might be like 3,000 years after Denisovan is gone. If we're looking at 30,000 years ago, which is one of the ideas with Denisovan's ending, our last of the Denisovan as a whole species, then we've been here for 20,000 years on our own by then, right? So this might be one of the shifts. I personally believe, though, that the shift is we get to a point where we start not belonging to the land, but the land starts belonging to us. When we get to this point where we can dehumanize the land and decide that the land is not its own entity and we can own it, we get to this point where we start owning other things and start having control. And we see a rise of narcissistic personality disorder when we're looking at the written records, right? When we see the documentation of what's going on with the kings and the rulers in this time period, we see a rise of narcissistic personality disorder. And so with that, we see ownership of land. We see what we call othering, OTHERING, which is don't worry about me stealing from you as your king, worry about your neighbor who I'm also stealing from. Right. And this is something that's really, really big within our society today. We start with the barbarians in the hills. It's not me as your king trying to steal your grain. It's the barbarians in the hills. So you have to give me your grain so I can rob you blind, so I can play my army so that they can protect you. We go from the barbarians in the hills to the people in that city over there. They're not as advanced as we are. So they're trying to kill us. So you need to pay me to keep an army so that I can kill them instead. We go from that to othering based on gender. We see this with the ancient Greeks, where we start to see there is women are weaker, women are less than, and this is where we start to see othering within our society. This is the first instances of othering within our society, and again, it is between gender. Once we get to a thought process of monotheism, we start to see othering based on religion. My religion is the right religion, your religion is the wrong religion, sinful, and therefore I can kill you. And after we get to othering based on religion, we start to see othering based on race. This starts slightly a bit in the early 1400s, and this is based on manifest destiny and the doctrine of discovery, which come before 1492 and are based about Europeans invading Africa. After we're looking at the manifest destiny and doctrine of discovery starting in the early 1400s when Columbus invades in 1492, we start to see the idea of race existing really popping up there. And this idea of race existing is the idea that is biblical. It is that those who are darker skin are marked by the curse of Ham, the son of Noah. And in the marking of the curse of Ham, therefore, they can be owned by other people, right? There's something wrong with them. We see that on the rise of the othering based on race, that in the 1800s, when we start to move away from biblical thought process and into a scientific thought process a little bit more, we see that the theory of race is developed. The theory of race is developed to kind of justify the atrocities that are being committed by white people. And when they're developing the theory of race to justify the atrocities that they're committing, they also develop the theory of eugenics alongside. The theory of eugenics has been used in everything from reservations and residential schools to Hitler. Okay, the theory of eugenics starts in Europe and America. The United States really doubles down on their theory of eugenics. They're still for sterilizing people based on the theory of eugenics, right? In the early 2000s, we start to see something called the Whole Genome Project. And the Whole Genome Project proves to us that there's more genetic diversity within a primary population prior to colonization than there is between primary populations prior to colonization. If you think about this, this makes sense. We all know that inbreeding is bad, right? So if you and your neighbor share a whole bunch of genetics, then your children marrying are going to be inbred. Even if you guys aren't siblings, it's still the same genetics. And that's why inbreeding is bad, is because it's genetics hitting each other cause mutation. So within a primary population, you want to be more genetically diverse as a species so that you can actually create healthy children. So we are more genetically diverse within primary populations than we are between primary populations. The Kwe people of South Africa have all the genes of the human population, except for those that we get from some other species. So they have all the Homo sapien genes. So we know that they're the oldest population on this planet. And after the theory of race is our method of othering. We start to get a little bit further. Today, we see that the othering that we do is based on immigration. It's based still on race and religion and all of those other things. And yet we've advanced it a little bit more. We've added another couple of things to our repertoire, right? So we see that the othering today is based not only on all of those things, it is also based on things like whether or not you have a home to live in and whether or not you're an immigrant, even if you've been on this land for 50,000 years, right? So these are the ways that governments keep you in check so that they can maintain control. If I can convince you that your next door neighbor who's as broke and as poor as you are is the actual problem, then you're not going to see that I'm stealing from you and killing you, right? So if I can give you that kind of propaganda and that gaslight, right? Like push you this way instead, I can maintain power over you. And so othering is something that starts when we see the start of the rise of violence, when we see the start of ownership of land instead of belonging to land, and we see the start of stratification within society. And all of these things have to do with maintaining control. All of these things have to do with somebody who needed to be in control of everybody else around them. And I personally believe that we kind of, hi, legal. I personally believe that we kind of bred for narcissism. Because, if a king is able to feed and clothe his children and you're not able to feed and clothe your children, you're going to marry into the royal family line. And if the royal family line has narcissism within it, you're going to pass the narcissistic genes down to your children, right? So I personally believe that's why we have like 15% of our population as part of the dark triad, because we bred for it, because it was the only way to make sure that our children ate, right? Thank you, everybody, for the gifts. So when we are looking at the start of our species, those are the things that I need you to understand. That we were here for thousands and hundreds of thousands of years without othering, without hating each other. And every time we saw something new, we fucked it. Literally, we have at least 8 other human beings, species within our species. We have ghost species in Turtle Island and Abiella, ghost species in Indigenous Australians, 3 ghost species within Quay and Yoruba people. There's a seventh ghost species that's within us, and I'm not exactly sure where with that one because it's like within the last 2 months. And then there's Neanderthal and Denisovian, so that makes eight with the new ghost species, right? So we see something new, we are attracted to it. We are not fearful of it as a species until roughly 10,000 years ago. And at 10,000 years ago, we start to see this rise of stratification, this rise of violence, this rise of othering, this rise of maintaining control, and this rise of narcissism. The people behind me on the wall are the Gervasians. This is 20,000 years before that. The Gervasians are in Europe between 40,000 years ago and 30,000 years ago. And the Gervasians, like everybody else on the planet at 40,000 years ago, who is a Homo sapien, okay, is going to be dark of skin, dark of eye, and tightly coiled hair. These happen because of where we speciate as a species. The dark of skin and the dark of eye help us in a high sun content area. So melanation is in everybody's skin. We're all melanated. Some people are higher melanation, some people are lower melanation. It's about the condension of the melanation. Melanation is also what causes the color in our eyes. So if you're in a high sun area, you have more condensed melanation in your skin because it keeps the UV rays out a bit, not completely, and it helps you not overdose with vitamin D because you can overdose on vitamin D. So, of course, people who are darker skin burn, right? Just like they bruise, just like everything else that anybody else does, right? Yet the higher concentration of melanation makes it harder, makes it a little bit easier for them within the sun, makes it harder for them to burn. The dark eyes are a highlight adaptation as well. Having higher melanation in your eyes means a little bit less of the light gets into your eyes, which means that you don't get headaches in the bright sun, means that you can see better in the bright sun. Whereas when you have light eyes, it's less melanation in your eyes. It lets more light in. And by letting more light in, you can see in a low light environment. Light eyes are the first adaptation that Homo sapien gets for the low light environment in Eurasia. What does the evidence say was the cause for the shift to occur? So, as far as I can see, Tommy, the evidence shows that the rise of violence starts with this idea of the land belonging to us instead of us belonging to the land. When we start to dehumanize the land, when we start to decide that the land's not a living being on its own, we also start to dehumanize other animals, which up until this point we look at as just being a part of the biome, like as important as we are. When we start to set ourselves above it and think that we own and control other things. I mean, of course, we've always had belongings like this is my spear, this is my knife, this is my shirt, right? But the idea that you can own things that are living and breathing, because the land is living and breathing and animals are living and breathing. And from all the evidence I've seen, we see that the rise of violence, the rise of agriculture based cities, and the rise of stratification is all at the same time, right? And so to me, all of those things are intertwined. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the only reason. There might be other reasons out there that I don't know of. And I might find evidence tomorrow that shows that it's something else entirely. So I don't know for positive, but so far, all the evidence points to this all happens at the same time. And to my thought process with what I read. So when you read about the early kings and queens in our first writings that we see, hieroglyphics and cuneiform, when we're reading about these people's typically what we're reading is something that's written several hundred years after them, just like we see that the sagas are written about people from several hundred years prior. They're written in the 1200s about people in the 700s. And so what we're seeing is the stories that are passed down when they're finally put into writing. And what we see from the stories that are passed down when they're finally put into writing, our first kings seem to be narcissists. You look at their childhood, they all have a very traumatic childhood. Almost always they're abandoned. Almost always they think that they're the child of a god. And almost always they have a rough childhood. And they use that to turn around and create a stratified society. So do Indigenous people from the northernmost portions of Canada have darker skin and eyes because of the sun hitting the snow? I've always been curious about that. Absolutely. So first, it should be understood that in Turtle Island and in Abiyala, North America and South America, respectively, that we do get a variation of skin tone. That in some of the extreme northern climates, you're going to get lighter skin tone. And in some of the equatorial regions, you're going to get darker skin tone, right? You can get extremely dark in the equatorial regions, and you can actually get very light in the Arctic regions. Um, There are many people, though, that are from the Arctic regions that are also dark of skin. You also see the fold on the inner of the eye. These things are sun adaptations. It's because when the sun hit, or not sun, snow adaptations. When the sun hits the ice and the snow, it bounces back up. And so that inner fold in the eye is because when the sun hits and bounces back, that protects. Um, and we do see that there is actually a variation in skin tone in Arctic peoples. That you see that there are people they in Turtle Island, the Arctic peoples all have a copper undertone to their skin, right? Yet you will see that some nations in the Arctic regions tend to be lighter than other nations in the Arctic regions who might tend to be darker, right? There is this fluctuation. And it is the darker, those who are still darker of skin within the Arctic regions is absolutely because the sun does bounce back up onto the skin uh, off of the snow onto the skin, like it does on the sand, actually, because it'll bounce off the sand as well, right? Um, so, well, and one thing that I am, so when we look at the top of the map, the other question here is I noticed that even in northmost portions of Russia, they have very indigenous features too. And a lot of conversation is done over whether or not Turtle Island indigenous people come from Asia, right? There's a lot of discussion on that. And it's not real. Like Turtle Island indigenous people don't come from Asia. Turtle Island indigenous people, the first wave of Turtle Island indigenous people to Abya is over 50,000 years ago, and it is through the southern boat route. We know this through the Denisovan DNA within them, and we know this through the Australian DNA within them. So they're actually going through the islands of the South Pacific. They stop in Australia a little bit, and then they go on to the islands of the South, through the islands of the South Pacific to South America. People are moving up into the Arctic regions, both in the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere at the same time, right? As the snow is receding, people are moving up into these areas at the same time. And if you look at the globe from the top instead of from a Western standpoint, you'll see that the Arctic region is actually very small. And if you know how to live in the ice regions and the snow regions, and many people can actually not only subsist, but they can thrive, right? You can We know that you can kill animals that are herbivore animals and eat the stomach contents to get your vegetation needs. So if you live in an area like the Arctic that doesn't have a lot of vegetation, you can kill a sea cow. I'm not sure if sea cows are in the Arctic, but you can kill an animal that eats a lot of vegetation. Like there are animals that will dive at the bottom of the sea and eat this stuff here, eat the stuff from underneath the ice, and you can kill those animals and eat their stomach content to get the vegetation needs that we have as Homo sapiens, because we do need meat and we do need vegetation, right? And so people in the Arctic have been crossing that region the entire time. Once people started getting to this top of the continent, people on both continents, people started crossing in that region. So the Inuit and the Sami actually share a lot of genetics, and Greenlanders and the Sami actually share a lot of genetics. And there are a lot of interchange in that region. And a lot of that is because there's a backwards interchange, like the X1 mitochondrial DNA is here in Turtle Island, but the X2 mitochondrial DNA is Siberia. So it starts here in Turtle Island and then translates back, because there is this interchange in the Arctic region the whole time. That is after people have arrived to Turtle Island and Abya, though. It is not something that they come to this space through there. Now, there are later migrations. There is the last migration to Turtle Island and Abya that does come through the ice-based region at like 8,000 years ago. Most of it, though, and most of the time spent in the Arctic is the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere meeting in the Arctic, right? The peoples from both hemispheres meeting in the Arctic, coming from the bottom up to meet, not coming from one and going to the other, right? And so you will see that there's a lot of exchange of features. There's even a lot of exchange of ideas, and a lot of exchanges of knowledges. You'll see that some of the, and this indicates similarities. This does not indicate sameness. Okay. So I don't want you to think that I'm saying that these people are all the same people, because they are not. You will, though, see that there are similarities in things. Like the Samis actually have structures that look kind of like teepees, right? That are built kind of like teepees. This is an exchange of information and ideas, I'm sure, somewhere along the lines. I can't point out where, but I'm sure somewhere along the lines, right? So, and again, that does not mean that they are sharing things, or they're the same, right? They're not the same. Even the structures have differences to them, right? So it does not mean that they're the same. It means that there is a share of information. We have never been in one place and only there. Like that's just not who we are as a species. One of the things about us is we have what we call expedient bipedalism. So we're constantly moving. It's one of the things that we need to do. We're constantly migrating, we're constantly immigrating, we're constantly moving. So when we're looking again at Europe, because this is what we are trying to look at today, what we're looking at is people who are going into Europe starting at 50,000 years ago. Now, we're seeing people moving into Europe at 50,000 years ago from the Levant area. It needs to be understood that the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant area at this point of time are actually attached to the continent of Africa. Those seas are not there because of the fact that the ice levels are there's so much ice, glacial maximum, that the water levels are lower. So the Arabian Peninsula is actually attached to the continent of Africa, while Homo sapien is living with Homo neanderthal in the Arabian Peninsula area and in the Levant area. At 50,000 years ago, there is a movement out of this area up into Europe. And at 50,000 years ago, with this movement out of this area up into Europe, we've already been with the Neanderthals for so long that we like half of our ideas and thought processes are coming from that intermix. And because half of our ideas and thought processes are coming from that intermix, the culture is very similar. And so as we're moving up into Europe, we're taking a culture that's already kind of similar into a space that these cultures are at. We're intermixing in these spaces. Kind of like immigrants, like we're moving into a space and becoming a part of the culture that's already there, maybe taking some ideas up into it. And I don't think all cultures have dragon myths, Amy. I think that the cultures that have dragon myths based on fossils that they've seen and based on different reptiles that they've seen. Um, I do not believe all cultures have dragon myths, though. I know a lot of cultures that don't actually have dragon myths, right? So when we're seeing that movement in, we're seeing that movement in as an immigration pattern, right? As Neanderthals are dying out and as the ice levels are receding, Neanderthals are dying out because they're becoming integrated with us. By the time we're meeting up with them, there's roughly 10,000 of them left as a species. That integration with us gives them new genetics. It helps their species carry on. There's more Neanderthal DNA on the planet today than there ever was during their time as a species because they were always a very small species. So they're not gone, they're still here. Their species as a whole, though, is gone. And then by the time their species as a whole is gone, at roughly 50 to 40,000 years ago, we've already been living with them in Europe. The ice is starting to recede, and so we're moving up. So we're moving into areas at this point of time that do not have Neanderthals in them. So we are the first sapiens in the area, and we are the first. You don't have to believe me, honey. Oh, you can ask questions even if that's awesome. I did not know that. That's a great way for y'all to ask questions. Whatever they just did, that's a great way for you to do it. So um, when we're moving up into this space, we see that they're moving up into this space at this time. Neanderthals are gone by this time or incorporated into the Homo sapiens at this time. So they're moving into a space that is not occupied, and they're moving into a space and settling in. Becoming indigenous to space is a huge thing. And a lot of people don't understand why indigenous matters, right? A lot of people don't understand what it is about it that matters. When you become indigenous to space, that becoming indigenous to space is about so we are all a part of a biome, right? We have a biome within us and we have a biome without us, right? Homeostasis is the maintenance of the biome within you. Homeostasis is the maintenance of the biome without you, right? We were kind of created to fit a niche. We were created by the planet to fit a niche within her biome. And that niche is tending. That niche is care of others, right? We're nurturing and communal as a species. It's biological. And we adapt our adaptations. These things are very much about nurturing and tending the biome as a whole and nurturing and tending other species as a whole, as well as nurturing and tending ourselves as a whole. We have to have community, right? So when we're moving into this space and we're moving into a biome, right? We're adjusting who we are for the biome and we're learning things about the biome. We're settling into the biome and understanding the biome. Now, as we're doing this as tenders, as we're doing this as a people who has not set themselves above the biome yet, when we're doing this, we're learning and becoming indigenous to space is about understanding the space how you interact with the space, and ensuring your interactions within the space are healthy. Now, you will find that people's languages develop as they become indigenous to space. And as they're developing their languages, becoming indigenous to space, you see that that development of language is particular for that space. It describes your needs being met in that space, right? So we look at things like eye bright is an herb that you can use to wash your eyes if you have eye infections, right? And it is said as eye bright so that you can understand that this herb is for your eyes, right? Feverfew is an herb that we use to lower fevers, right? And you can understand this in the name of the herb. When we're looking at names in an indigenous space, things are named for their purpose. Things are described so that you can understand them just by the stating of the word, right? One thing I like to always talk, or like to, one thing that I like to utilize as a way to describe this is I come from the Pacific Northwest. In the Pacific Northwest, we have dozens of words for water falling from the sky. And the reason is because we live in a space where water is falling from the sky almost 365 days of the year, right? Like you might get 2 weeks in the summer where it's dry and that's it. Now, and I'm not just talking snow or hail, which are two distinctive things that we all know of. I'm talking rain itself. I can describe rain to you in a dozen different ways. And because I can describe it to you in a dozen different ways, the words that I'm using are going to tell you what you're facing. If I tell you it's raining outside, you don't know what that means so much, except for the fact that there's water falling from the sky. If I tell you it's drizzling out, then you know you probably just need a coat, right? If I tell you it's pouring, then you know that you need your rain boots and a heavy jacket, or a waterproof jacket. And if you're from somewhere else, you might want an umbrella and something to cover your head, just different things. So because I said it's pouring out, that it's really raining. But if I say that it's drizzle, or that it's misty, right, or it's misting out, you might understand that, if you're from the area at least, or even not. I mean, if I say to you drizzle, you see that it's light. It doesn't mean a lot. Yet if I say that it's sheeting or pouring, you're like, holy shit, it's really rainy out, right? So when you have words that are actually descriptors of the thing that's happening, it gives more information in language, right? It gives a better informative value of the language. And so we see that as we're moving into space and becoming indigenous to space, one thing that adapts within space is language to describe space. The other things that adapt is how we interact. You might come from a space where you're using big palm trees. You might come from a space where you're using palm trees to create your spears. Palm trees are actually pretty flexible, so they create spears in a really healthy manner, right? There's a lot of bounce to it, so if you're throwing it, you get less breakage of the spear. You might come from a space where the trees in the area are palm trees, and so you're making your tools out of palm trees, so you understand how this wood works for these tools. And as you move into a space that doesn't have palm trees, you have to look at the woods around you to try and make sure what you're going to use to make your spears from. You might choose lodgepole pines if you're in a space that has pines, because lodgepole pines are extremely straight pine trees, right? So maybe you're making your spears out of that. You probably aren't choosing oak because it's so hard that it's not necessarily the best thing for a spear. It has no flexibility to it, and it's got a lot of knots in it, and you don't really get oak to be straight. You might choose cedar, still not one of the best things for spear. It's kind of a soft wood, yet it might be better than oak if all you have is cedar or oak, right? So you are learning the space and adapting your needs and adapting this yourself to the space, as well as in your understanding of the space and the way you tend the space, adapting the space slightly. When Europeans arrived in Turtle Island, they documented the entirety of Turtle Island, north to south, east to west, as tended gardens. You would walk through and you could pick fruit from the trees, and you could grab berries from here, and it's all tended, because tending is an extremely healthy interaction with the environment. Animistic cultures around the globe have always tended. We think of these as hunter gatherers, we think of these as collectors. What it is truly is tending, right? When you're tending something, you look at the cycle of the life of the plant or the animal, and you base what you take based on that. So you might take the old and the infirm when it comes to the animals, As you're tending plants, you look at the time when the plant is dormant, and you might prune the plant during its dormancy so that it can actually grow fuller in the next. We see us do this with roses today, right? You always prune back your roses in the fall and in the winter so that they can bloom better in the spring. So as you're tending, you take a couple of pieces here to prune and a couple pieces here to prune, and these pieces together are what you need. You don't take more than what you need, and you make sure that you're doing it in cycle with the plant in what can be described as honorable harvest by some nations, though overall for animism, it is really just tending, right? If you're looking at it as a global scale. So as people are moving into space in Europe and becoming indigenous to space in Europe, these are things that they're taking into account. You might find like the Gravachians are along the Mediterranean because during that time frame, everything else is covered with ice. And so because they're along the Mediterranean, shells are a really big thing with the Gravachians. And as you can see from this headdress, we're also assuming elk teeth are. This is taken from a carved goddess, and you can't really tell what is the headdress. We're just assuming it's shells and teeth. So you might along the Mediterranean be utilizing shells in your self-decoration, but as you're moving into the mountains, you no longer have shells in your self-decoration. Maybe you're using teeth or claws or bits of fur, different things for your self-decoration, because as you're adapting into space, you are learning different things about that space and incorporating them in your identification. You might have been using ochre for painting your body or painting your clothes or painting your cave walls this entire time, and yet you move into a space that doesn't have ochre in it, and so you start using charcoal for that instead, because charcoal is readily available everywhere that you're burning wood for fire. So we see that as we're moving into space and becoming indigenous to space and adapting our life ways to space and understanding the space, our interactions with the space are on a healthy level that tend the space and create better. Another thing that we see with indigenous cultures when Turtle Island was invaded is that you could see cities that were huge. The five civilized tribes and the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, the what we know now as Iroquois, these nations were hundreds of thousands of people living in cities together. Literally, there were more people living in the cities here than you were seeing in some cities in Europe. The cities here were healthy and they were clean. They weren't filled with disease. And this is because of an understanding of the environment, of living within the environment instead of setting yourself above the environment. We know that the rise of disease actually comes with the rise of cities. When we start being civilized, we see that Europe, the disease levels rise. We don't see the levels of disease, we don't see plagues. We don't see massive diseases affecting large populations until we see cities. It is well known that cities breed disease, right? So when Europeans come to Turtle Island and they see that the cities here on Turtle Island aren't breeding disease, they actually start to learn something about sanitation, right? Because cities here are vast cities. You can't really tell all the time that they're vast cities because they're very incorporated into the garden that has been created here, right? And they're, you're not like the Romans. You're all not shitting in the same shitter every day, rubbing each other off with the same sponge dipped in vinegar across your ass, right? Like there's a level of sanitation because of the understanding of the interaction with the biome. So when we're looking at us prior to city building, prior to that rise of violence, prior to 10,000 years ago, animistic cultures are utilizing that interaction with the biome on a healthy level, and that interaction on the biome with a healthy level creates a space, creates communities that are healthier, right? Not only is there a lack of food, right, a lack of starvation, there's also a lack of disease. There's also a lack of a lot of the interactive issues that we have today. And a lot of us like to think, oh my God, we saved ourselves from the predators. But the fact is that you can live in a cave and keep yourself safe from the predators, right? If I'm in a cave, all I have to do is build a fire and the predators are staying out because predators don't come to fire, right? So there's a lot of different ways in this interaction with the environment that people are becoming indigenous to space. Now, it is during the Gravachian period that we start to see our first tattooing. We see our first tattooing tools in France at 35,000 years ago. Now, that doesn't mean that it all starts in Europe. That doesn't mean that it's not other places. That just means that's where we find our first tools. We, as modern day archaeologists, find our first tools. And it should be understood that this became realized when somebody found what everybody thought was a discard flake that had a singular point on it that had blood and pigment on the singular point when it was tested. And so that's how we know that we have a tattooing tool from 35,000 years ago that is a single point needle. So now we're looking back through all the things that we thought were flakes to see where tattooing might have been in there, where they might be single point needles, right? So it's important to recognize that some of this stuff, it's not that it's, we thought that we were 200,000 years ago as a species until somebody redated a find from Morocco with modern day tools and or with newer tools. And because carbon 14 dating is problematic and they use a strontium isotope dating. When they redated, they found that the skull from Morocco that they thought was 40,000 years ago was actually 300,000 years ago. So as we're coming up with new tools and new understandings, a lot of times because we're allowing Indigenous and Black people and non Western thought people, non European people within the fields of science, within the fields of academia, within the fields of anthropology. And as we're allowing people within, we're learning more because we're kind of starting to listen a little bit, right? Kind of starting to understand a little bit as academics. So we're having newer understanding. And so just because this is our oldest tool that we have doesn't mean that it's going to be our oldest tool that we have forever. It's just currently our oldest tool. So we see that during the Gravatian period, our oldest tattooing tools are starting to be found. So we know that we are tattooing our bodies as early as the Gravatian period in France, right? And I've been talking for a minute, so my mouth and my, give me just a second. I forgot to put on chapstick before I started to, and that makes it easier. So as we're moving in and as we're becoming indigenous to space, we're taking the knowledges that we have, we're taking the identities that we have, and we're adapting. Now, we have to adapt to space. The amazing thing about Homo sapien is the fact that we can adapt as easily as we can, right? And the fact that we're so expediently bipedal. So that adaptation to space and that expedient bipedalism, they both come from Homo erectus. Now, Homo erectus makes it across the globe, and as they speciate into other species across the globe, like Homo heidelbergensis, we start to see light skin alleles, our lower melanation alleles, become present. We start to see those because people like Homo heidelbergensis are speciating in a low light environment. Neanderthals are speciating in a low light environment. So we start to see the lighter skin alleles coming into play. It still takes a long time for adaptation to happen. And it still takes, that doesn't mean that they're coming into play here and then everywhere else. What it means is they're coming into play here. So we see that at 900,000 years ago, our first light skin alleles are coming into play. And we see this within Homo heidelbergensis, a subspecies of Homo erectus. And we see that Homo heidelbergensis passes this down to Homo neanderthalis. Now we have to understand that lighter skin does not mean everybody is Northern European white. What it means is that the scale of skin tone is a lighter shade of scale instead of the darker shade of scale. Just like in Africa, you can get every skin tone underneath the sun pre-colonization. In Europe, you can get every skin tone underneath the sun pre-colonization. In Asia, you can get every skin tone underneath the sun pre-colonization, and the sun has everything to do with it. Turtle Island and Abiyala are the same. You get every level of skin color because of where we are at in equatorial regions, what the level of sun is. Now, we know that we get genes from Neanderthals, yet I have a dark skin allele from Neanderthal and a light skin allele from Homo sapien, right? So I have a dark skin allele over here, which isn't very present, obviously, and a light skin allele over here, which is a little bit more present, right? So you can have alleles from both species that have different ways of showing up, right? And one might trump the other, right? So your light skin doesn't come from being Neanderthal. Your light skin comes from being descendant of Homo erectus and having the ability to have light skin, having the ability, the genes, because erectus was around for 1.2 million years before the light skin allele develops within erectus, right? So when we're seeing this adaptation to space happening, the cool thing about us, the advantage that we have is that we can adapt, right? It is not that we are light, it is not that we are dark. Dark is more of an advantage in every region than light is, okay? Dark skin is actually okay and livable in every single region because you can get vitamin D elsewhere. Then light is, there are many regions that light can't go into without it killing them, right? So if we're looking at which one is more advantageous, dark skin is more advantageous. Yet the true advantage is the ability to adapt. We do see that it takes roughly 100 generations to adapt. And we also see that it takes forever for Europeans to get lighter skin. We know that at 10,000 years ago, Cheddarman in Britain is dark of skin, and the alleles are literally defined by science as sub-Saharan black skin alleles. Okay. So we know that Cheddarman was extremely dark of skin. When we are looking at his descendant, his 300 generation direct descendant who lives less than a mile from where they found Cheddarman, we're looking at somebody who is extremely light. Cheddarman have blue eyes. His descendant also has blue eyes. Cheddarman have blue eyes. This is the first thing that we adapt when we're moving into Europe. And the reason our eyes adopt first is because, again, light eyes is a low light adaptation. And I need to see whether or not the predators are going to kill me before I need to have the excess vitamin D. I can get vitamin D from plants. I can get vitamin D from other sources. I cannot see the predators are coming to kill me if my eyes are too dark and I can't see as well in the low light environment. So we see that the low light environment adjusts our eyes first in Europe, and then it adjusts our skin, and it adjusts our skin much later. Otzi is a brown man, and that's 3000 BC, so 5,000 years ago. Otzi is a brown man, and it's defined as Middle Eastern brown. Like the alleles are what we associate with Middle Eastern brown. So Otzi is a brown man, Cheddarman is a black man, the Gravatians are black men, right? So when we're looking at this, we need to understand that as we are moving out of Africa, we're moving out of Africa with the adaptations to sun that we got speciating in Africa. And it takes a while for these adaptations to change for the regions that we're in. Again, we are adapting to space. We are adapting our understanding of self to space, and we are adapting space to us as well, right? So when we are looking at trying to reconnect, right, trying to understand our own heritage and our own connection, we're going to talk about that next. I want to go ahead and open up comments for a few minutes. It seems to have been pretty stable, so I can assume that for the most part, everybody's been in here for a minute. It might be a little bit less trolly. I'll leave it open for a couple minutes. We'll see if it gets too trolly. I'll leave it open so people can ask questions about what we just went over. And then I'll go ahead and we'll go over to different ways that you can find to connect to European and heritage, ancestry. I do want to specify before I do that, there are current alive working to thrive indigenous groups within Europe that are very, you can be Celtic and you can have Celtic indigenous ancestry, right, from France. And your ancestors in France could have been indigenous in France if you take it back far enough. Yet the current indigenous groups are not French Celts, right? So when you are talking about being indigenous and talking about reconnecting, right? If you are claiming to be indigenous, you need to have connection to a current alive indigenous group, right? And you can't sit there and go, well, I'm indigenous Celtic and have no connection to the current alive Celtic groups. There are current Celtic descendant groups that are fighting for recognition as Indigenous people and are fighting against the colonization that they have been fighting against for, in some cases, over 1,000 years. So you can't sit here and go, well, I'm Indigenous because my French ancestors 3,000 years ago were Indigenous. Indigenous is about being connected. When you are indigenous, you are connected, not just to the land, the community of the land as well, right? Now, you can be in a diaspora and be indigenous and not be connected to the land. You can be a descendant of an indigenous group that is currently active and you weren't born within that group because of diaspora, because of colonization. I know people who are Sami who are here in Turtle Island who are absolutely still connected to their groups, still connected to their people. And you can be, there are many people who are indigenous in Turtle Island who should belong to nations in Turtle Island who were taken in the 60s swoop. That does not make them any less indigenous because they do not have the connection because they grew up outside of them. You cannot, though, be indigenous to a group that is no longer existent. Let me repeat that. You cannot be a member of an indigenous group when that indigenous group is no longer existent. And you really need to be careful about the way that you are phrasing things a lot of the time, too. I know that people are like, Vikings are indigenous. No, they're not. The Scandinavian people, the people of Sweden, the Swedish, are not indigenous. By UN standards, they're native, okay? Because they and the Sami arrived in the area at the same time. The controlling governmental group is the native group. The non-controlling non-governmental group is the indigenous group. So when you are looking at reconnection, it is important to understand you are connecting to your ancestry. If you are connecting to an indigenous group that is still alive, then you must be actually seeking connection with that indigenous group. If you have Sami blood, I have Sami blood, right? Great movie, by the way, Sami blood. I have Sami blood, right? For me to be indigenous Sami, I would need to trace that ancestry, go to the Sami people, show that and say, I want to reconnect. I want to be a part. I want to help my community. I want to be a member of this community, right? And I'm bringing these things to the table. What can I do to do better? How can I do this, right? That is about being indigenous. You cannot go, the Parisi Celts were indigenous 2,000 years ago. And I can be a descendant of the Parisi. I am a descendant of the Parisi. That does not mean that my indigenous group is Parisi, right? It does not mean that the indigenous community that I'm a part of is Parisi. It means that my ancestors were a member of an indigenous group that no longer exists, and that group was the Parisi, okay? I'm going to go ahead and turn comments on for a few so that people can ask questions based on that. And then we'll go into some of the things that you can do for finding ancestry and for connecting to your ancestry, for trying to connect and decolonize without appropriation of other cultures. While I leave it for just a second, I'm going to go and grab something to drink. You got a lot of love to do to meet me. You got a lot of love to do to meet me. Yeah, you do. 62 or 63? Oh, so maybe you don't have a lot of leveling to do to meet me. I'll have to get out there and try and beat you. We play games and oh, I need to. I hold on for that, please, because I need to do that too. Again, we argue over who's the better and the badass, right? Thank you. Oh, thank you. I like this. I got this in Pike Place Market like 10 years ago. One of my favorites. So I'm not going to really discuss a whole lot about Turtle Island indigeneity. On my website, I have information about rewriting the Western Hemisphere. But even though I am Turtle Island indigenous, I'm not a culture keeper, and I'm not here to teach Turtle Island indigenous information or knowledge. I will give Turtle Island indigenous people access to knowledge so that they can have things that they need going into academic circles or talking to white people, right? But I don't do a whole lot of stuff, right? On Turtle Island indigeneity. Again, I'm not a culture keeper, right? But on my site, Crazy Monsoon, the Inuit Ord right there, under the Rewriting the Western Hemisphere tab, there's a bunch of information about the finds that we have here that date it. We can see that there is a species that was here prior to us, right? That was a descendant of Homo erectus. That's the Cerruti mastodon find at 130,000 years ago. The Hill Locas find in the southern tip of Mexico that has three datings. One is 50,000, one is 250,000, and one is 800,000 years ago. And those things will give you some information. There's a few different sites that will show different timelines, to kind of push that back and try and give some uh, as Indigenous people, we know our own history. Oftentimes, we're told that our history isn't true, though. And so, this is one of those things for the ability to go, yeah, you say it's not, but even your people say, because we know that sometimes you have to talk white people speak to get to white people to listen, right? You got to talk like a white person sometimes to get the white people to listen. And so, I have some of that information there for people, but I don't. There's a lot of Indigenous creators on here who will teach Indigenous knowledge, who are culture keepers, who are, uh, embroiled in community and stuff like that. And I don't want to take that space. That's not my space. And I think that people should be culture keepers if they're going to teach things. And I'm not a culture keeper. And so I don't find it appropriate. Um, I absolutely, though, am always trying to give tools, more information to um, siblings so that siblings have that ability to be heard. It's hard to be heard sometimes, right? It's hard to be heard. And so I definitely want to give the ability for people to be heard a little bit easier. But I don't want to be one of those people that's taking up space that should be used by other people. I'm doing the jobs nobody else wants to do, right? Not the jobs other people could do, right? And this is a Gravatian man, and I believe it's Tom Borkland. You can access Tom Borkland through my website underneath the tools used page, as well as Kenneth and Kenneth, which is where I get a lot of my other images from. Thomas Borkland does an amazing amount of prehistory artwork. He's got a lot of I don't think he's the one that does my profile picture. I'd have to relook and see where that one is from. But he does. There's a lot of Neanderthal artwork that I use that he does. It's just absolutely beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And so, yeah, if you have an at for Michelle, that would be awesome. So people can grab that at Lightning. And I don't know why that. I don't know why that went weird, but if you know how to find Michelle or an app for Michelle Lightning, that would be helpful for people. Um, there are a few people. Uh, Natira in our chat actually works really hard on helping people reconnect. Um, there, woman with bows is actually Tanda is an amazing human being, and they do a lot of teaching, and they have created space for teaching life ways to people who are disconnected and are trying to find life ways again. Um, so those are a couple of really good people. If you don't follow Chi Jim, you should follow Chi Jim. Chi Jim is he's not teaching things, but he is using as fuck. Actually, I came to TikTok because of Chi. He's a Facebook friend and somebody I know, and there he does these amazing videos. And I came into TikTok so I could watch his videos, and then I stuck around for a little bit. So that's another. Yeah, Chi is fucking epic. I adore him. I was actually watching his sister get ready this morning as she did a live. Angela Jim is another amazing human being on here. Let's see. I'm trying to think. I mean, I have a lot of Indigenous friends, but I'm not sure which ones are really teaching a lot of history. Um, uh, Inuit Potato, and I know that that's like her regular name, but she's got something Basa Masa, something else is her name now. She teaches a lot of stuff about being Indigenous up north, um, and so there are a lot of Indigenous. Uh, Turtle Island Indigenous people. If you if you go into my following list, like the people that I'm following, there are a few people in that list that are, and mostly the names will give you information as to whether or not they are. Tonka is another one that's really cool. Yes, though Tommy, so again, this is one of those things where we're dealing with the diaspora. I want to answer this question. Tommy asks, so just for clarification, As an African American with roots in Sierra Leone and Gambia, I can still claim those indigenous cultures, knowing said people that are still there. Absolutely. And from everything I know of many different spaces in Africa, if you were to go there, you would be welcomed home. You know, you're a lost child who was stolen and you would be welcome home. Um, you can absolutely reconnect to and try and become a part of indigenous culture from a diaspora where you have been disconnected from that indigenous culture in situations like this where you've been stolen from that indigenous culture, right? Um, and in most indigenous cultures, you'll be absolutely welcomed into that indigenous space and into that indigenous culture because they recognize that theft of you, that their descendant is theft or is stolen. So most indigenous cultures have a very big connection to ancestry and to descendant, right? So there is your ancestors are still here so much within you. We know this today as epigenetics, right? And then your descendants, the things that you do matter for your descendants. So for many indigenous cultures, a child who has been stolen 400 years ago, that's still a child of that culture, right? And so many indigenous cultures will absolutely take that. Yes, this is from the earliest migrations out, right? Um, so many indigenous cultures will absolutely welcome you back in. And if you were Sami and here within Turtle Island, and you were like you went to the Sami and you're like, I'm trying to reconnect. Even if you can't access and you're studying everything you can and you're speaking to your ancestors and you're trying, that is definitely reconnection in diaspora, right? And I don't want to try and make the big difference that I want to give is that claiming to be an indigenous person belonging to a culture that no longer exists and that's your only connection to your indigeneity often silences actual and currently thriving indigenous groups currently working towards autonomy, currently working towards sovereignty, indigenous groups. And so you don't want to claim to be Parisi and I'm indigenous because I'm Parisi and you have to hear me because I'm indigenous, because you're silencing other groups. Yet if you are in the diaspora and you are trying to connect, even if you can't actually reach that culture, but you're trying to connect the knowledge that you have of that culture, you're speaking to your ancestors, you're connecting to that space. You should not speak to these people, right? Or not speak for these people. You can speak to, I'm sorry. You should not speak for these groups, right? As somebody who has Sami blood, I might do everything that I can to reconnect to my Sami ancestry, but I'm not going to speak for Sami people because I don't have the right? That's not my lane. That's not my space. I'm not a culture keeper, right? So I'm not going to speak for the Sami, yet I can try and yeah, don't you dare. uh, so I'm not going to try and speak for them. I won't speak over them for absolute, right? So when I'm saying that if your indigenous group is no longer there, I don't want you to sit there and go, well, I'm indigenous, so I get to speak for indigenous people. That's basically what I'm saying is that it too many people are trying to silence everybody else, right? And really, we try and silence, especially in the Western Hemisphere, there's a lot of silencing of Black and Indigenous people, right? There's so much, like ways to try and, make sure that Black and Indigenous people aren't heard, right? Even pretendians, right? That's a way that Indigenous people aren't heard, right? And this is one reason that I'm not going to teach Indigenous things because I think Indigenous people who are culture keepers should teach those. I am Indigenous and I'm not denying my indigeneity, yet I'm not a culture keeper and I wouldn't speak over people who are more connected, right? I'm not a member of a tribe. Why would I speak for the Dakota if I'm not a Dakota, right? So um, that's the point with that. It's not that you can't claim that you're a member of a culture that's still there. You can absolutely claim that. If you have that bloodline and you have that ancestry and you're doing everything you can to reconnect, please. And again, if you are Black in America, there is people that will recognize you as family in Africa, right? There I have yet to hear of a community in Africa that's like fuck those people, right? Every community in Africa that I have ever heard of sits there and goes, God, come home. We love you, we miss you, your family, right? So absolutely, especially when it's talking about something like that. In fact, most indigenous communities across the globe are like that for their descendants, their children, right, that are lost. They welcome them home. most indigenous communities, though, don't want to be silenced either, right? And the idea that everybody's indigenous to somewhere sometimes is used to silence people, right? And that's what I want to avoid, right? I want to avoid the idea that I'm indigenous to somewhere, so I get to speak for indigenous people, right? I don't want people to go, well, my ancestors were Gravatians, so I was indigenous, so I get to speak for all indigenous people, right? And that's the difference that I was trying to point. But you are absolutely, and thank you for asking that, and thank you for the ability to clarify so that that is understood. If you are a descendant of an indigenous culture and you live in a diaspora, I don't know of an indigenous culture who's like fuck off. Every indigenous culture I know is welcoming people home and wishes they come home, right? So you are absolutely welcomed. Um, and it is really about, it is really about the idea of not silencing others, right? Because we have so many people who want to silence everybody else and not let, if I was not raised indigenous and have some Turtle Island indigenous ancestry and start claiming that Turtle Island indigenous ancestry, and I decide to tell you that because I have Turtle Island indigenous ancestry, I get to speak for indigenous people or speak over indigenous people, I'm silencing indigenous people. That's a problem, right? Whether or not I have the ancestry or not. Um, when we are utilizing uh, those things as tools to continue colonization, to continue Western thought, to continue the suppression of groups, we'll see that there's a lot of people who will do that, especially people of European descendancy who will, well, everybody's indigenous to somewhere, so I get to speak for indigenous people. Or, the creator on here who was trying to make Scandinavian religion a closed practice because it was indigenous. And it's like, girl, you don't know what indigenous means. Like, it's not indigenous people of Scandinavia, right? So that's the point that I want to try and make sure that people understand. No, I didn't say that DNA is a requirement. I said connection was actually. So yes, and that happens a lot. That happens a lot, Monsoon. There's so many people who are part of that have lost, and those are another group of people that are being welcomed home with open arms. Welcomed home with open arms, right? So, so let me clarify, just because I saw this come in, right? Um, this is what Europeans look like when they get to Europe at 40,000 years ago, right? That's not what Europeans look like in 1492. Anybody who looked like this in 1492 was either from Africa or Australia. That does not mean that there weren't people living in Europe who were Black of African descent, right? But they were recent descendants of Africa, like last generation or two, right? Because again, we all move around all the time, right? By the time that Columbus gets to Turtle Island, and he doesn't even get to Turtle Island, by the time that Columbus invades Abiyala and hits the Taino people, the people in Turtle Island are copper colored skin, whether it's very dark or very light, it's all got a copper undertone. And they have extremely straight hair that's extremely coarse, is what it's called, right? And this is all of the descriptions of Europeans finding Turtle Island indigenous people and Abiyali indigenous people. So, well, Homo sapien all starts in Africa. Again, as I mentioned before, there are ghost species here in Turtle Island. That's probably where we get our copper undertone, is from the ghost species, to be really honest. There's a ghost species in Turtle Island and Abiyala, and there's a ghost species in Australia. So the ghost species that was met by the Homo sapiens here, we see that documented with the Ceruti Macedon find, with Heotloka. These are species that speciated here, multi-regional speciation, like Neanderthal speciates in Europe, right? And species that, as Homo sapiens, when they arrive in Turtle Island, have enveloped within them. Now, Turtle Island indigenous people have DNA that African indigenous people do not have. If you have African heritage and you are Black in America today, you do not have, unless you are mixed, which many are. Afro-indigenous is an absolute thing, and I am not denying it on any level. But if you are Black in America today, which is the way that we group, right? And it's the only it's the only skin tone that's grouped by its skin tone, right? But if you're black in America today, you are a descendant of the African slave trade, of the cross Atlantic, or the southern, oh fuck off, I've got so many different words in my head, the transatlantic slave trade, right? You might have indigenous descendancy as well because there was intermarriage or interrelation, but you are not Turtle Island indigenous. Turtle Island indigenous people have a copper undertone to their skin. And when Europeans arrived in Turtle Island, they were copper skinned, documented, and straight, coarse hair, documented in every case. In every case. Now, Africa has a lot of beautiful heritage, a lot of beautiful indigeneity, and you can find what country that you came from or your ancestors came from in Africa with a DNA test. Right now, my heritage DNA is doing it for $33 with a DNA test. My Sudanese grandmother, who came over on the transatlantic slave trade or came over in the transatlantic slave trade, I was able to find and trace her through DNA. You can absolutely trace to where you're from in Africa, right? But unless you have Turtle Island indigenous ancestry as well, you are not Turtle Island indigenous. You are indigenous to Africa, right? No, they migrated out of Africa into Europe, but the people that Europeans met were no more black than the Europeans were. And they hadn't been black for as long as the Europeans hadn't been black. So you're as Turtle Island indigenous as you are European. And I know that it is hard to be disconnected, right, Mama? So Mama is what many people would refer to as Afro-Indigenous, right? She is indigenous to Turtle Island because she has, I might be misgendering you, and I apologize if I am. Mama has ancestry that is from Turtle Island and ancestry that is from Africa, right? No, that's not true. My DNA tests, I take it to other sites and I can compare it to actual archaeological graves. I can compare my DNA to my DNA is the same as Kennewick man's DNA, and my DNA is the same as Cheddarman's DNA. I can trace my ancestry to Cheddarman and to Kennewick man, right? Because I can look at that, right? And you can actually get those links and you can see those links, right? We're talking about European indigeneity. I'm answering a few questions right now. Okay, awesome. I just wanted to make sure. I try not to decide based on a name. Mama tends to, but like I just try not to decide. Actually, so Ancestry and 23andMe are problematic, and I'm not going to debate that. They are. They only test a percentage of your DNA, and their sites themselves don't really deal with it, right? That doesn't mean that those DNA tests can't be used elsewhere, right? And it doesn't mean that things like the Whole Genome Project aren't absolutely done by everybody. Like, so the Whole Genome Project is a global thing. People from Africa, people from Europe, people from Asia, people from Australia, all people of all colors are in on the Whole Genome Project, right? So it just doesn't work like that. I know that there is, and don't get me wrong, I've described a lot of the racism within academia, a lot of the racism within European, white Western thought academia, right? I've also described a lot of the fact that was justification for atrocity, right? That does not mean that all the smart people are white today. I just want you to listen to what you're saying, that all the scientists and all the smart people and all the people that know things are white people, that people who are black and people who are brown don't know shit. That's what you're saying, right? You're saying that people who are black and people who are brown don't know what white people know. And it's really, and I know that, like, I know that you have to hear it from somebody else to really see what you're saying, but really what you're saying is is that white people know more than black people. That's just really shitty. Like that's just wrong and really shitty. Like, it just doesn't do that, right? It's not how it is, right? Um, so I mean, I know that there's a lot of racism within it. I know that there's a lot, that ignores all of the Black and Indigenous people who are moving into academia and overthrowing the thought processes, who have moved into science and overthrown the thought processes. That disregards the Black and Indigenous people who contributed to the debunction of the theory of race because they moved into those spaces and they, changed and revitalized and brought forth the truth, right? It discounts all of the truth that Black and Indigenous people that Black and Brown people are bringing forth, right? And that's why you sitting here going, well, it's only this, and so that's not true because only white people are doing this. That's not true. That discounts the fact that Africa has their own DNA projects, right? It discounts the fact that Africa itself contributes to that, right? And that's not appropriate. That's not appropriate, because that's shitty to all of our ancestry, right? That's shitty to all of our ancestry. No, I'm not triggered. I'm passionate sometimes. I'm expressive. I'm extremely expressive, but I'm not triggered, right? They were saying that only white people are in control of DNA, and because only white people are in control of DNA, that it's not accurate. And I'm telling you that that's just not true. That discounts all the Black people that are involved in it. It discounts all the brown people who are involved in it, right? And erasing an entire culture is pretty colonizer behavior, right? If you're going to erase Turtle Island indigeneity because you don't know what your own history is, that's pretty white. I don't care what your skin color is, that's pretty white, right? There is a difference between pretendian, right, and ethnocentric. And pretendian believes that Indigenous people existed and that they're a part of Indigenous culture, often lying. Um, and ethnocentric erases indigeneity completely to Turtle Island and states that indigeneity in Turtle Island didn't exist. And to erase an entire other group of marginalized people who have gone through just as much trauma is extremely inappropriate. It's extremely white and it's extremely colonizing behavior, right? And that's just not appropriate. So again, just because our species starts in Africa doesn't mean that. So by the time people get to Turtle Island, they have Denisovan DNA within them, and they have a ghost species DNA within them that you don't see in people from Africa. People from Africa don't have Denisovan DNA, and people from Africa don't have that ghost species. They do have three ghost species if they're Yoruba or Kwe, but only the Yoruba and Kwe. And then they wouldn't have Neanderthal DNA, right? So people in Turtle Island have Neanderthal DNA, Denisovan DNA, and a ghost species DNA. Two of these are very unique. One of them is only seen in this space. The Turtle Island Indigenous people, we've been here for over 54,000 years. Our first way getting here is a southern boat route through the South Pacific, where we have picked up Denisovan DNA, and we are absolutely indigenous to the space. We've been in this space longer than people have been in Europe, right? So absolutely. And what I'm saying is that, you know, what I'm saying is that erasing the transatlantic slave trade gives white people a lack of accountability, right? Gives white people a lack of accountability. States that white people didn't commit the atrocities that they committed. And that's not appropriate. My grandmother would be pissed. You're erasing what she went through. Right? So that's what I'm saying. Hey, cuz. Okay, so the person behind me is a Gravatian, and this is one of the earlier groups in Europe. It's the first group in Europe without Neanderthals in Europe. Um, Logan, I don't know why you were muted. They might have misunderstood what you were saying. Usually the muting isn't for very long. We do try not to mute for the entire live, so you should be able to go back in. When it gets really bad, it is hard for my mods, who are just people who come into my chat and agree to help, to keep up on it. So if they muted you by accident, I apologize. It does happen sometimes when chat starts getting really weird and bad, right? They can't keep track of anything either, and they're just trying to do their best. And So, and as you've seen, nobody's allowed to spread that BS in my chat. Just so you know, it was probably a mistake, right? And especially, I mean, it was obviously a mistake if that's not what if you weren't contributing to that thought process. Um, it really goes back up usually. And absolutely, you can go over to YouTube like you did, right? But it shouldn't be for the whole thing. It should only be for a few minutes. We do try and make sure we only do it for a few minutes. And it was obviously a mistake. They are though, like there's maybe three in here right now, and they are really just trying to do their best and trying to keep up with making sure that there aren't people being shitty, right? Um, okay, so I can go into what I need to go into next. I am going to turn these back off just because we know we're already seeing how it gets, right? I'm going to turn these back off. Okay, so let me answer this one really quick, Adam. So you want to say that the Solutreans probably from the Iberian Peninsula across the Atlantic. The Solutreans are 27,000 years ago. Solutreans were probably Black people on the Iberian Peninsula. Absolutely. Um, if the Solutreans made it to Turtle Island, though there is absolutely no evidence that the Solutreans crossed an entire open sea, which is the difference. Okay. Um, and there's no evidence of that. If the Solutreans did, they were still not Black by the time Europeans arrived here. They were still copper by the time the Europeans arrived here. If it was the Solutreans from the Iberian Peninsula, the Solutreans from the Iberian Peninsula, though genetically, are the ancestors of the Celts of the Iberian Peninsula. The genetics of the Solutreans translate down like you can trace the family lines down between the Solutreans and the Celts. The Atlantic is an entire open ocean. The islands of the South Pacific, the Ring of Fire in the South Pacific, I'm going to go ahead and turn this off just because so I can make sure I keep track and so it's a little bit easier for me. The islands in the Ring of Fire in the South Pacific, if you look at the islands of the South Pacific and if you look at what's called the Ring of Fire, basically it's a volcanic shelf along the South Pacific that's like circular shaped, right? And that space creates islands and decreates islands on a regular basis. Like you can go on YouTube and watch islands popping up out of the sea. And we know of spaces that just disappeared underneath the sea in this space. We also just found a continent that's been lost for 300 years that was in the South Pacific. We only have the tip of the continent now. It was a huge continent. It's documented in many history books, right? So, or many ancient histories. So, okay, Logan, it won't be muted on the next. Is it Logan Trent in here? Are you Logan Trent on TikTok as well? Can one of you guys, and I have turned it over to subscriber only, but can one of you guys take a look and see if Logan Kent is on the muted list and remove or unmute if he is on the muted list, if that name is on the muted list. We'll see what the name is. But those islands are coming and going. And those islands go across the entirety of the South Pacific. And if you look at the South Pacific and the way that the South Pacific, Australia, and those islands meet up with pretty much the continent of South America, you can see that it is much easier to island hop across the islands of South America than it would be for you to cross the entirety of the open Atlantic. There are not a bunch of islands in the Atlantic. There's not a ring of fire in the Atlantic. There is an entirely different sea in the Atlantic than there is in the Pacific. And the boat routes that we look at for the Pacific are boat routes that either the Kelp Highway is the northern boat route and it follows the coastline up across and skips over and goes down, right? I don't know how either, sweetheart. But thank you for asking. I don't know. Let me see if I can find it. I don't know. Okay. Oh, it's Abra. Oh, so sorry, Abra. Um, I'm not sure how to do it, and I don't have Sleepy in here right now. Um, let's see. Aha, 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 aha. Got you, Abra. Okay, I got it. It's underneath the settings, and underneath setting, there's muted accounts for next time. I got them unmuted though. We are on subscribers only, so I don't know if you can talk, Abra, but when I take it back off, you can. Um, Absolutely, Abra. Absolutely. So the islands in the South Pacific kind of form a route. Like they're easy to hop across. And the northern boat route or the Kelp Highway follows the coastline. So in both of these cases, you're looking at there not being an open expanse of ocean, whereas the Atlantic Ocean is a constant open expanse. Okay. So this is the difference between coming over through the islands or through the Pacific Ocean versus coming over through the Atlantic Ocean. Now, we do know that there are routes through the Atlantic Ocean that were taken. We know that the Vikings came over in the Atlantic Ocean, right? We know that there is the hopping across the Scandinavian, the Hebrides into Iceland, into Greenland, into Finland, right? So we know that there's that migration, not migration, but that movement over. And we actually know that there's DNA that came back. Like there are people in Iceland who have mitochondrial DNA from Turtle Island. There is interconnection between the Sami and the Greenlanders, right? So we do know that there, and we do also know within the Arctic, there's a lot of interaction and intermovement. There is Mansa Musa, which is an African king. And this African king was Islamic, and he documented everything he did because the Muslims writ their shit. Like they wrote everything down. And so he had court documenters who documented everything he did. And Mansa Musa went all over Africa. Mansa Musa made it to Mecca because he was Muslim. He never left Africa. There is a predecessor of Mansa Musa, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, who is said to have left with 300 people in 1380 and gone west with 300 people in his ship, and he never came back. So there is a possibility that there were 300 people who got here who were African, who intermixed with the nations that were here. Yet 300 people doesn't translate to 10 million in less than 100 years. And by the time the Europeans got here, Turtle Island indigenous people were between 50 to 100 million people. You can't get 100 or even 50 million out of 300 people. And you can't get in less than 100 years 50 million out of 300 and the entire two continents. And that's 50 million in North America, in Turtle Island. That doesn't count how many were in Abya. You cannot translate 300 to 50 million and an entire continent covered in under 100 years. So all of the things that are used by ethnocentrics to try and show that the people that Columbus found were phenotypically Black or African, none of it's real. None of it's true. And I want to say that I grew up knowing that my grandmother was an escaped slave. I grew up knowing that she had escaped pregnant with her master's child and that she had had to pass and that her children had had to pass. She didn't pass as easily, and I knew that, but I knew that her children were able to pass. I grew up knowing this. I did not know where from. I knew that it was a part of the transatlantic slave trade. I knew that she had lived in slavery. I knew that, probably her ancestors had as well, right? There is a disconnect that those of European descent and those of Turtle Island indigenous descent do not have. That people who are of African descent and are victims of the slave trade or survivors of the slave trade have, right? When your children are stolen from you, your children don't learn who their parents are. And we do actually experience some of that within Turtle Island indigenous people when we get to things like the residential schools and we get to things like the 60s swoop, right? Imagine that happening for generation upon generation upon generation upon generation. So by the time you get through 300 years, somebody might not even know who their parents were, let alone their great grandparents, let alone their eighth generation. So there is a level of disconnect that is harder and more painful and more traumatic for people of African descent in the United States, people of slave trade descent within the United States. That level of disconnect, and in other areas in the Western Hemisphere, that level of trauma and that level of disconnect is extremely hard and extremely painful. And I can understand wanting to find connection. Can absolutely understand wanting to find connection in other spaces and in other ways, because we all want to feel that connection to our ancestors. We feel our ancestors in our bones. We all do, whether we like to admit it or not. We feel our ancestors in our bones. Is what epigenetics is, right? That level of disconnect is hard and it is traumatic. There are so many people who are Turtle Island Indigenous who will help you to remove that disconnect. I know people who will pay for you to get a DNA test so that you can figure out where you're from, right? There are so many people who will do everything they can to help you reconnect. But just like people don't want Europeans to reconnect and appropriate culture while reconnecting, people don't want their culture stolen and people don't want their culture erased. And when you are saying that Turtle Island Indigenous people don't exist, that they're just half black and half white, and that's why they look like that you're the actual Indigenous person, you're erasing an entire people who have already faced a genocide. The transatlantic slave trade was an extremely traumatic, horrific experience. It was not a genocide. Turtle Island Indigenous people have been facing a genocide. We're not even acknowledged as existing. And when you further that lack of our existence, when you try and state that we don't exist, right? All you're doing is upholding white supremacy, allowing white people to not be accountable for their actions, and erasing your allies in a fight. Because really, Turtle Island Indigenous people and the Black descendants of slaves within the United States, we're in this together, right? Not just because I'm mixed and not just because so many of us are mixed, but we're in this together because we're fighting our own eradication and our own destruction, right? We're fighting trauma. We're fighting people's belief that we're less than, right? We're fighting people trying to silence us. We're in this together, right? This is stolen land built on the blood of stolen people. And we have to see that it is stolen from one people and built on the blood of another stolen people. Because if we don't see that it is stolen from one people and built on the blood of another stolen people, we cannot overcome and get rid of the trauma that we're all living in, right? And it is definitely not, it is not an Indigenous way to race other Indigenous people. So if you're going to claim to be Turtle Island Indigenous, you need to actually like try and be Turtle Island Indigenous, right? Like if you're going to claim that you're the Indigenous people, then follow the Indigenous thought process of not erasing Indigenous people, right? And in all of that, I want everybody to remember, because this is hardest for our siblings who are Afro-Indigenous. This is hardest for our siblings who are Afro-Indigenous. And if you are erasing Indigenous people, right, by claiming that you're the Indigenous people and they don't exist, you're erasing half of your Afro-Indigenous siblings' identity. You're making it harder for them to move within Indigenous communities. You're making it harder for them to get enrolled in their nations, right? You're making it harder for them to move in Indigenous communities. So you're harming other Black people. Okay. And if you are trying to replace or erase an entire group of people, you're harming an entire group of people. And it does. It also disrespects the story of your very real ancestors who survived their traumas long enough to give you life now, right? The resilience of surviving the transatlantic slave trade is a huge thing to be proud of. That's an amazing, beautiful, wonderful thing to survive that exodus trauma, right? That removal trauma, that disconnect trauma, and to have lived through the trauma of slavery. The trauma of chattel slavery is one of the most horrific things in our timeline as human beings, right? The trauma of chattel slavery is huge. And to erase even portions of that trauma, like the transatlantic voyage, right? Like the Southern Passage, right? To to erase those things erases the heroism, erases the resilience, erases the strength, erases the beauty of our ancestors. And I say our ancestors because you're erasing my grandmother. You're erasing what she went through. And to erase that is offensive. I'm not triggered, right? I am passionate. I'm not triggered. I still find your erasure of my grandmothers on both sides of that fence and your free pass to my grandfathers who were not good human beings to be pretty fucked up, right? So, yes, we all start in Africa as a species. Yes, when we all arrive to space, we look like this. Doesn't matter what space we arrive to, we all look like this when we arrive, right? 50,000 years ago, we all look like this. By the time Europeans arrive in Abya, we are a copper skinned people with uber straight hair that is coarse. And one of the reasons that the transatlantic slave trade happens is because they try to enslave the Turtle Island indigenous people, but because it's their home, they can leave. They know how to escape. They know how to live off the land so they can get away and they can hide up in the mountains and they can go down into different spaces and find hiding space. So they keep losing Turtle Island indigenous people. And so to maintain their shit, they have to go and get people and remove them from their homes so they can't run away, so they can't leave, so they can't escape, because now you're escaping into a place that doesn't look like anything you understand or know. That's a part of the reason for the transatlantic slave trade, is because they could not enslave the indigenous people without the indigenous people being able to get away, because it was their homeland, right? And so when you remove somebody from their homeland and transplant them, they don't know how to interact in that space, right? So this is one of the reasons that the transatlantic slave trade happens. You have to remember the resilience and the beauty and the power and the heroism of the men and women who were stolen from their people, shoved in halls, transported for months at a time across an ocean, dying all the way, and then sold into brutality. And if you don't respect your ancestors enough to acknowledge the resilience and the heroism that that took, that's on you. Please don't disrespect my ancestors to that extent. Okay. As for the fact that people in Africa sold their children off or sold people off, there is a huge difference between pre-chattel slavery and chattel slavery. The entire globe had pre-chattel slavery. This is indentured servitude. This is many different forms. Okay. Pre-chattel slavery doesn't change the status of a human being into the status of livestock. Chattel slavery changes the status of a human being into the status of livestock. So when people in Africa were in wars or raids and they captured people and they enslaved people, those people had the ability to earn their freedom. Those people had the ability to no longer be slaves. Their children often weren't born as slaves. So when people were selling slaves to the Europeans, they weren't selling livestock. They were selling human beings who had human rights. The Europeans changed that. So if I am selling slaves to somebody else, and my knowledge of slavery is that you can get free, you can marry out of it, you can be freed, serve your period of time and now you're a member of community, your children aren't enslaved. But that's my understanding of slavery, and I sell somebody who's one of my slaves to somebody else, but their understanding of slavery is now this person is no longer human and all of their descendants are no longer human. I'm not making that connection when I'm selling off a slave. I am selling off somebody who I believe is a human being. And so when people from Africa sold African slaves to Europeans, it was an entirely different type of slavery. Your ancestors were not sold thinking that they were going to be treated the way that they were. Your ancestors were sold thinking that eventually they would come home once they worked through their period of time. And so this thought process of why did Africans do that to us, or well, that must mean that that's not this, or blah, 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 is a lack of understanding of the nuance of what pre-chattel slavery was and chattel slavery was, right? And that nuance is extremely important. That nuance is every single bit of the difference. We have slavery in the United States today. The 13th Amendment does not delegalize slavery, it delegalizes chattel slavery and reinstates indentured servitude, which is a form of slavery, not chattel slavery. Your indentured ancestors were not slaves to the US like chattel slaves were, so don't use that shit. But it is a form of slavery. And it is the same form of slavery that we see pre chattel slavery, indentured servitude, serving a period of time, being caught in a war, being deemed by society for some reason or another that has to serve a sentence. So we see that with the prison system today, and that's what the 13th Amendment did. It criminalized chattel slavery, except in instances of, and that's what the 13th Amendment actually says. Nobody will be owned or enslaved except in instances of. And so this is where we get prison systems today. So the slavery difference, the nuance of that slavery difference is an extremely important thing for people to understand. And it is extremely important to not deny the resilience, the heroism, the sustainability, the love, the power of African people who were transported to the United States, Canada, South America, the Western Hemisphere, a hemisphere that was not their hemisphere, a space that was not theirs. What the fact that they were transported out of their space into another space did was imprison them in so many ways, right? Because they had no route of escape, right? They had no people to get back to. How do you cross the fucking Atlantic to get home, right? To ignore that, to try and say that it never happened, to ignore the resilience, to ignore the history, to ignore the lived through trauma, to ignore the beauty and heroism of a people who were able to overcome and sustain throughout that is a disservice to everybody's ancestors, including your own. And to erase an entire other marginalized group, you know it's wrong. You know it's wrong. You know in your heart it's wrong. You don't even really need me to tell you. I will, but you don't even really need me to tell you. You're looking at people who should be your allies, and instead you're trying to erase them. You're looking at people who would gladly help you, gladly, because they have lived through as much resilience as you have. They have had to be as resilient as you are to be here. And they would gladly be on the same side if you weren't trying to erase their existence. That is my take and my say on who was here in Turtle Island. Okay. All the documents point to the fact that we are talking about a copper skinned, uber straight, coarse haired people. Everything. You can't find anything that states any different. They specifically, anytime that they use the word black, they say not black as in Africa, they say black as in New Guinea, which is an entirely different black. And what they are saying is, and they say the skin tone is black as in this people. Sometimes they'll even say black as in from India, right? The skin tone is this dark. The hair is uber straight and uber coarse. And that is across everything. There are some, well, they will even talk about how the indigenous people are very light of skin. So there are some areas pre-colonization that are very light of skin, and they actually document that as the Europeans are invading, they document that. So I understand, having spent my life trying to find my own ancestors' space prior to the transatlantic slave trade and who they were in Africa. I understand that level of disconnect. And I understand that level of disconnect because as I've moved through 2020 in Portland and Standing Rock and fuck, most of the people I knew in the military were black. As I've moved through those spaces, as I've talked to my own family, I understand how painful that disconnect is. There are so many people who are wanting to help you find your own indigenous ancestry, right? Helping you find that connect. There are so many people out there. And well, I don't take that lane because I don't believe that's my lane. I will absolutely help people find ways to do that. If you want to connect to your African ancestry and you can't find anybody to help you connect to your African ancestry, hit me up and I'll do my best, right? I'll direct you and guide you into spaces and places where you can find that. So many of us are more than willing to help you find that ancestry, help you find that connection because there is power in connection and we all know that there is power in that connection, right? There is an overcome within that connection, and when that's removed from you, it's very hard and very painful and very disconnected, right? There are so many people out there that would help you with that. They just ask that you don't erase them, right? Do I feel that the lighter skinned indigenous people would have been viewed in different regard to their darker skinned cousins, the way lighter skinned Africans were viewed? Absolutely. And we actually absolutely see that. We absolutely see that the Europeans document the lighter skinned indigenous people as being more beautiful, right? They see them in a different way, and they document some people are so, what they documented it as is they're light skinned, they're beautiful because they're light skinned like the Europeans. And that's what the documentation states. So let's go back into what we were talking about with European ancestry. And again, I'm not going to do, I'm just going to go over a few things. I've been here for God, almost 3 hours, and I do have other stuff to do, but I do want to go over a couple of things. As we are looking at reconnecting to Indigenous ancestry across the globe, again, I want to remind you that there are Indigenous groups across the globe. So when you're doing that, please don't decide that I'm connecting to my Gravachian ancestors from 40,000 years ago, so that gives me the right to speak for Indigenous people. That does not give you the right to speak for Indigenous people. You should really only allow culture keepers to speak for Indigenous people, right? Unless you are entirely embroiled, maybe on a council or things like that, you should not be speaking for Indigenous groups, right? Um, there is still the ability to find that connection, to reconnect to that Indigenous heritage so that you can decolonize your thought processes to help other people's decolonize their space, and so that you can sing to your ancestors, feel your ancestors, find that connection. It's a very important thing to have connection, right? Connection to the world, connection to the earth, connection to the biome, connection to other people. I do want to remind you, though, that, erasing other people or claiming to speak for other people is never a healthy thing. It's never an okay thing. I'm going to go over a couple things that are pretty global in Indigenous culture. First, I want to state that animism is pretty global in Indigenous culture. But even in that, not all Indigenous people are animistic. So animism states that we're all interconnected, that the animals and the trees and the world around and the earth, it all has a soul, it all has a being, it all is important, and it all matters on an equal level, that we're, as humans, not set above, but we are in fact interconnected and a part of. And that's what animism is. And for the most part, most Indigenous cultures have that. Globally, this is who we are prior to this idea of, hey, gorgeous, prior to this idea of owning land. When we get to the point that we own land, we dehumanize land, and we no longer look at land as equal, this is where we move out of animism. This is something that prior to, and in every space, there are people who move out of that concept, right? So it's not that Western thought spreads from here and nobody in Turtle Island thought of it before Western thought got here, because there are people who were non-animistic, who are Indigenous cultures in Turtle Island. For the most part, though, everybody prior to 10,000 years ago or prior to say 20, 30,000 years ago has that interconnectedness with culture or with the world. They believe of themselves as just another animal in the biome. When we're looking at that, um, I'm going to talk to you about different ways that animistic cultures find for connection to the biome. So you can look at this and find where your ancestry might be, and then utilize that knowledge of your ancestry for that interconnection. Again, I want it understood that just because somebody is indigenous does not mean that their culture was an animistic culture. There are many cultures out there that were not animistic that are indigenous cultures. Nothing is global. As a species, there is nothing that we all do, not a single thing on this planet that we all do except change, die. That's it. We all change and we all die. That's the only thing that we all do. We got it, honey. I got her. Um, so when, oh, it's under share though. She knows exactly where it's at because I was in a different place for me. So when we are looking at what animistic cultures are doing to interconnect, what we're looking at is again that interconnection, that belief that the animals are a part of you, that the trees are a part of you, that the world is a part of you, and that you're a part of it. That interconnection can express itself in different ways. And I'm going to go over some standard ways of expression. Many cultures have a belief that they imbibe the spirit of the things that they eat. So if you eat deer, you're imbibing the spirit of the deer. I have a thing that I put behind me that says "Eat the rich." People are like, you want to eat the rich? And I'm like, not really. I mean, I can get other people eating the rich, but I believe that I imbibe the spirit of what I eat. And so I am not going to eat the rich because I don't want that spirit in me, right? So many animistic cultures believe that what you take in gives you the spirit of that thing. So if you are taking in an herb, you're getting the spirit of that herb, right? And that imbibing of that spirit of that herb is what is helping you. If you take in an animal, you're getting the spirit of that animal, and you can imbibe or you can utilize that spirit of that animal. You see things like you might look at mountain lions as being powerful and creative, or not creative, powerful and oh God, there was another word and it was a C word and it's not working. But you might look at mountain lions as being powerful, right? And so you might actually eat the heart of a mountain lion when you kill your mountain lion so that you can imbue the spirit of the mountain lion so that you can imbue that strength and that power. Okay, that hunting prowess, right? The spirit of the lion coming into you so that you can imbue that so that you can enact those qualities. Okay. And the same thing with herbs. The herb is, in the thought process that herbs have spirit, right? As much as the plants and animals both have as much spirit as you do, right? We all know that trees can talk now. Trees actually form matriarchal clans and nations that are forests, right? So if I am imbuing the spirit of the oak, right? Maybe I eat acorns, right? And by eating the acorn, I'm imbuing the spirit of the oak, which is a spirit of strength, solidarity, long lasting, right? And nourishment, right? Um, so maybe I eat a lot of salmon because I'm a people of the salmon. The Scandinavians, there are many groups in Scandinavia that are actually people of the salmon. They consider themselves people of the salmon, just like there are many Turtle Island indigenous groups that consider themselves that way. And so maybe during the salmon hunt or during the salmon run, I imbue the spirit of the salmon, and the spirit of the salmon could mean different things from different people. For some, it might mean resilience, that's swimming upstream year after year, right? For some, it might mean cold water abilities, right? So that spirit might mean different things for a different culture because that animal signifies different things for a different culture. So when you are eating, that's something to look at. If you're trying to reconnect, for one thing, you might want to eat things that have to do with the area that your ancestors are from. If you know that you're from a water based region and your ancestors are maybe from the Mediterranean, you might eat seafood from the Mediterranean, right? You might buy it online and get it shipped to you, right? I don't know if animism has ever really disappeared anywhere. I think that animism is still everywhere. It's just in certain groups. I was asked a question: how long did it take for animism to disappear from Europe's people? And I think that there are many of the indigenous groups within Europe who still really embody an animistic thought process. Um, so you might go and you might order online, and you might get snails from the Mediterranean, right? Um, and so you might imbue the spirit of that. Now, this is another thing that's going to be very important if you're doing this. Um, when we talk about tending an honorable harvest, right? This includes animals. If I've hunted since I can remember, right? If I'm going to go out hunting and I don't anymore because I don't know if I can clean shot anymore because of trauma. If I'm going out hunting, I ensure that I get a clean shot, and I ensure that I thank the spirit of the animal as it departs, and that I utilize every bit of that animal, right? If I'm going to go and buy my meat from the grocery store because I can't access going out hunting, which living in a city currently I have to do, a way that I can kind of reenact that or kind of make a healthy base there, because I know that any meat I buy in the grocery store did not have a beautiful life. It did not have a healthy life, had a lot of problems in their life. If I am going into a grocery store and buying meat and I want to eat that meat, what I'll do personally is I will talk to it as I'm preparing it. Thank you. I know that your life wasn't the best, but I hope that your spirit on the other side is happy and joyous, right? And I really thank you for the nourishment that you're giving me so that I can continue on, right? So I give it love. So I work with it. I talk to it. I interact with the spirit, right? So that I can give some honor to the spirit that's passed on, so that I can give some connection to the spirit that's passed on. Um, this is a way in a space like we're living in cities today. It's really hard to get things that are honorably taken care of, right? I grew up with people like my parents raised sheep and shit like that. So I mean, I've grown up with meat. I got venison in my freezer from my father bringing me venison. Like I've grown up with the ability to access that, but where I'm in the city, I don't have the ability to access that. And because I don't have the ability to access that, I've adapted. Everything traditional was once brand new. I've adapted. And so I'm able to understand that if I'm talking to the spirit of that animal, I can maybe give that spirit some peace, right? And thankfulness. Um, so you can absolutely order things from France if that's where your ancestors are from. And when they come to you, you can absolutely, if they weren't done in an honorable manner or you don't know the way they were done, you can absolutely at a later date give that honor, right? You can absolutely give that spirit interaction, give that spirit love, right? So this is one way for an understanding of an animistic sense to connect to the indigenous ancestry that you have in a space. So if you're in when you're tracing it back, the ancestors who were indigenous to France. You might look at the different meats that are available in France. You might look at the different cheeses that are available in France, because cheese and milk and stuff like that were stuff that was used by indigenous people in Europe and stuff that was used by indigenous people in Africa, right? These come from Africa and Europe in their earliest iterations. Lactose tolerance comes from Africa and from there's a space in Europe and a space in West Africa where we get our first lactose tolerances from and our first interactions with milk as a animal milk, right? So when we are interacting, you can go and grab cheese from those areas, right? And again, that's imbuing the spirit of the animal that cheese comes from. You are going to, I don't know what your life was like, right? Um, I'm sure that your life wasn't as beautiful as you wanted it to be. And if that's the case, I want to ensure that on the other side, you're doing better, as you're interacting, as you're preparing your food, as you're working with it, right? Another thing that is pretty global with an animistic thought process is the connection with plants. Just like you have that connection with animals, you have that connection with plants. That imbuement of spirit, that understanding of the interrelationship. Um, it is not like I look at my dog. I mean, I call my dog my kid, right? But that's because I look at my dog as its entirety of its own spirit. And I recognize that my responsibility to that spirit is to care for that spirit because I chose that responsibility, right? That does not mean that I think that the dog is actually something I gave birth to, right? So you recognize that these are their own spirits and they share the same importance that you share, right? You recognize that we're all related right? And they might be your cousins, right? Uh, you don't look at it like as an animistic sense, you still see the differences in those interrelations. And this is important because of the fact that we like to think that whole means ignoring all the voices, right? When something is a whole, it is many. And when something is many, you have to hear all the voices. You have to listen to all the things. You have to, like, if you are a whole community, that whole community has people within it who weave, has people within it who make tools, has people within it who hunt, has people within it who tend the fire, has people within it who care the children, has people within it who gather. And all of those things are important and all of those things matter. So the whole is not a singular, the whole is a many, right? And it's the same thing with plants and animals. They're a part of the whole, they're a part of the many. Their spirits have as much importance as your spirit. Their spirits and your spirits provide two different things, right? You are not the same, you're just on the same level, right? Um, and that's important because a lot of people will think, well, indigenous people think that it means that plants and animals are the exact same as us. And it's not necessarily that. It means understanding that there is a soul there, understanding that they're of equal importance, but recognizing the individual things that everybody brings to the table. And all of those individual things unified provide healthy community, right? So when we're looking at talking to the trees or interacting with the trees or interacting with the plants in the area, it needs to be understood that you're recognizing it as a living, breathing being with its own right to autonomy, with its own right to sovereignty over itself. You do not recognize it as being the exact same as you. Would be a difference that I think that I have seen expressed as wanting to be understood. So, um, if I am interacting and trying to imbue the spirits of the plants, I might do that in a few different ways. So, one of those ways is smoke cleansing. This is something that we see within animistic cultures on a global scale so far. Um, what we're looking with smoke cleansing for you to individualize it to your own animistic heritage is going to require you to understand A, where your ancestors come from, and B, what interactions they had with the environment. So, if you're looking at France and you know that you're indigenous, when you trace it back, once you get to the animistic thought process, we're in France, right? So, what do I do to work with that animistic or indigenous thought process in France? Um, I look at the environment within France. I look at the plants in France, that rhymes, and I look at the medicines of the herbs within France, right? And I look at the trees within France and I look at the animals within France. If I want to smoke cleanse and I'm looking at the plants within France, lavender is something that we all know comes from France, right? There is European sage. Don't use white sage unless you're a member of an indigenous nation into Turtle Island, right? But there is European sage. So you might use European sage. I am a poet and actually, I knew I was a poet. I was a poet before I was anything else. That was one of the first things I did actually. So, but um, so you're looking at the plants that are indigenous to that region, and you might use the plants that are indigenous to that region for your smoke cleansing. Rose is something that's pretty global, so you might use rose in your smoke cleansing. You might use lavender because you know that lavender is there within France. You might use a European-based sage that is specific to France. Say you're going Scandinavian in your Scandinavian ancestry, cedar is something that is used within Scandinavian regions, right? Anywhere that cedar is, you're going to see cedar used. Um, Anywhere that something is, you're going to see it used by indigenous people. Animistic cultures are so interconnected with the world that they're utilizing every part of the world, just like you utilize every part of the animal and you utilize every part of the plant, right? Even if something is poisonous, you might utilize it for something, right? So you're utilizing every part of the world around you. So definitely don't burn things that are poisonous because that's probably not going to go over well for your health. Um, you can, though, look at what plants are indigenous to that area and what properties those plants have. So, say you're trying to, use smoke cleansing for so this is Turtle Island Indigenous, just because it's what's on my brain are the easiest I can do this. Douglas fir is actually an anti-viral for your lungs. So during the start of the pandemic, I was actually in an indigenous gardening class in college in the start of the pandemic, and that's where I found Robin Kimmer's Braden Sweetgrass. And our teacher told us as we're leaving the class, we have to go home and finish everything else online. And she told us, she says, if you can find Douglas fir in the area, it's very populous in this area, and you put it in water and let the steam, right? So you can utilize different plants as a smoke cleansing to heal your body. So you might burn some Douglas fir as a smoke cleanse for your lungs for an antiviral within your house, right? That is obviously Turtle Island indigenous. I don't know where else Douglas fir is. There are still things within every area that do that. So you might get a book on herbology of the region of the area that you're looking at. And in that book of herbology of the region, the area that you're looking at, you can then determine, if I'm trying to smoke cleanse so that I can stay healthy, I might use this herb. If I'm trying to smoke cleanse to drive away negative spirits, I might use this herb. If I'm trying to smoke cleanse to prevent a pregnancy, I might use this herb as a smoke cleanse, though I'd also probably ingest it too. So you can look at what is indigenous to that area and utilize the indigenous things of the area that your ancestors are indigenous to in a smoke cleansing way. Now, abalone is a global thing, so you might use abalone. If you don't want to use abalone because to you it feels like you're appropriating indigenous culture, because for some people it will feel like you're appropriating indigenous culture, or it just doesn't feel right for another reason, appropriating Turtle Island culture, or it just doesn't feel right for another reason, you might utilize some of the other things that are out there. Now, the Gravaceans obviously aren't going to have iron or going to have glass, but many indigenous cultures actually have iron and have glass. And there are many indigenous cultures that actually use iron, right? In fact, African indigenous cultures, there are quite a few that iron is a hugely important thing and it's associated with a deity, right? There are indigenous cultures in Europe that will use things like tin, or not tin, bronze, or not necessarily gold, but different metals that they might be using prior to the advent of iron, right? So you might utilize those things to create your bowl. I'm going to show you guys something. I'll bring you over in just a second, YouTube. I'm going to show you and share with you guys my altar. Now, I want to reiterate in this that when I do this, I am not, my stuff is so intermixed that I cannot tell you currently whether or not what I'm showing you, some of them I can tell you which cultures that they come from, but I can't tell you with all of the cultures, right? So if you are working on smoke cleansing, right, you might have an abalone shell. Again, this is something that is global. But if you feel like using abalone makes you feel wrong or like you're appropriating Turtle Island culture, you might use a cauldron or anything that is iron based, right? And this is a really great way to do smoke cleansing. I have a charcoal in there that you can put, and then you just put the herbs on it, right? You can also, I don't use that for this. This is a mortar and pestle, but you could also use marble or stone in like a mortar, right? You could also, this was made for me by my daughter, right? This is something that is pottery. So you could also use a pottery piece. This is something that many people will use for smoke cleansing. This is just metal, and you can use that, right? So these are all different things that you can utilize for your smoke cleansing, right? Now on my altar, again, I'm very I'm everything. So I have a bit of everything, right? For me in this, I usually need things to hold my candles, okay? So this is actually, I know the person who does this meadery, I know this meadery, they're friends of mine. And so I use one of their mead bottles. I love mead. It's one of the things I use as an offering. I have a lighter. Everything traditional was once brand new. We used to light fires in different ways. We don't light fires like that right now. I have a lighter. This lighter is dedicated to my altar. It sits on my altar. It's been cleansed. It's been given spirit for my altar. It sits here. It interacts only on my altar. I don't use it for other things. I have a little thing back here in glass that keeps a bunch of different herbs that I might use for my smoke cleansing. I'll kind of grind them up in my mortar and pestle, and whether I clump them up and put them in my abalone shell or I put them in my cauldron on a thing, I'll burn the herbs. You can absolutely use feathers. Feathers are a global thing that we've been using. If you are in the United States using any bird of prey feathers, you're not allowed to possess them. Those are something that you must be a member of a federally recognized tribe to possess a feather from a bird of prey. So you're not going to want any bird of prey feathers, right? But you can have feathers, maybe you picked up one outside and you really liked it and it's not a bird of prey feather, so you can have it. You can utilize feathers. Anything that has to do with hunting animals that we might have hunted. This was supposed to be at one point a rattle handle. I still have the rattle somewhere, and it's from like when I was 14. But I have this antler here. My dad had given me that. Like he hunted and got that. So you can include that or incorporate something like that in your altar to bring you the strength of those things. I have a child who is my stone witch. So she gives me stones. Everywhere I turn, I have purses full of little rocks and little stones. I love my little stones. And so I have different stones that mean different things. I don't know what they mean most of the time because I don't do that. I'm not a stone witch, but I have those. My mother has been a fiber artist for most of my life, which she will shear her sheep and she'll dye them, dye the wool in traditional dyes. She does Bronze and Iron Age fiber arts. And so I have this because I've been using a drop spindle since I can remember. And so my drop spindle is a part. I have, when I was in Iraq, they would trade you dollar bills for their money because their money was useless. And they thought that we had our president on our dollar bills. And so they would trade you their money for dollar bills. And this I got literally reaching out as I rode shotgun in a 5-ton. And a little kid gave it to me. So I have that on my altar because it represents global people and it's a connection. I spent time in Islam as a child, and it's also time as a warrior, right? It's representative of that. Eggs are something that are pretty cross-cultural. I have these because me and my children did Ostara one year, and this is what we did for Ostara. Well, this is what we do pretty much. We did a few years when they were younger. So these are all different little pieces that you might have. This is a paper mache rattle my son made me one year. This is a bell. Many cultures believe that by ringing the bell, you call in the spirits, right? At the back of my altar, I have family members, pictures. This was created by my dad's mom. The man who raised me, his mom, did this. And so I have this for her. My oldest daughter made me this a few years ago. This was a gift that I was given Mother's Day a few years ago. I was walking through Pioneer Square in Portland, and somebody was giving out artwork to other mothers. This is an artwork by one of my children. I have pictures of my children. I have pictures. This is Tina Walking Stick. And Tina Walking Stick was a victim of MMIW in 2022. And she was my sibling. I grew up with her and her sibling. And she was of great importance to me. And when she died, I put her on my altar for my ancestors to help care for her. And her children, though I won't show their picture, is also on my altar so that my ancestors can help provide for her children in this time. And so, like here's a picture of my mom and dad when they got married. This is me in the foreground licking a spoon and my baby sister in his arms. This is Zappa. He married us, not the real Zappa, but we all call him Zappa, right? He also married me and my first husband and me and my second husband. He will not be married me and my first husband. Unfortunately, Zappa's marriages don't always work out. I think my parents is the only one that's actually lasted the test of time, right? So these are different ways that I incorporate different things into my altar, different ways. And let me go ahead and show YouTube a little bit of those things as I'm doing this. Yes, I don't know if I can get you there as easily.
So one second, everybody. I just want to show YouTube a couple of the things that I was showing. And let me make sure that I am able to, there we go. So I was showing how I utilize this. This is a cauldron and it's iron, right? This is something of glass that my daughter made. This is the meat bottle that I was talking about that is made by some friends of mine. This is their meadery. This is the money that I was talking about from Iraq. And the drop spindle. And the jar of herbs. And the grinder. And then, of course, let me see if I can make sure that she is there. This is Tina Walking Stick, my sibling. So as you're utilizing these different things, as you're working with these different things, you can use your intersectionality, right? Use the different things that are a part of you. Use the different things that you actually might understand or are a part of, right? And interconnect them, right? Because it is all about interconnection. It's all about connection with your ancestry. It's all about connection with the planet. It's all about connection with the biome. So there's a few different ways that you can utilize those things. Again, you can utilize smoke cleansing, and there are different vessels that you can use for smoke cleansing, right? There are different herbs that you can use for smoke cleansing. You can also, so again, in the United States, it is illegal to wear anything associated with a bird of prey, right? And it's illegal to be in possession of any artifacts, right? Which should be an easy understand, right? So you might look at the idea that flint napping is something that's global, right? And so maybe you you want to be connected in that manner. And so maybe you're out, you find somebody who flint naps and you find a knife, right? You can absolutely utilize that. That's not something that is specific to Turtle Island. It is something that's global, right? You can even, you can even go to an indigenous creator to Turtle Island who is, flint napping and utilize, though if you're going to do that, I would avoid things that are specific to Turtle Island. So I wouldn't look for a Clovis point, right? I would look for something that, you might find in every other space as well, right? Because arrowheads are arrowheads and knife blades are knife blades with the exception of a few. Or you might just go and get obsidian. This was a gift from somebody. And I keep things like this around because they're connection, right? This is obsidian. You can see just how fine you can get with obsidian, right? Just how beautiful it is, right? So you might connect on that level, right? Again, feathers are okay, but you can't use things like bird of prey feathers here on Turtle Island. This is protection for Turtle Island Indigenous nations. It is right. Whether you like it or not, it is right because it is protection for Turtle Island Indigenous nations. You can, though, use feathers from other things. You can use, utilize different bird feathers in, your dressing, in your decoration of self, right? Piercings are global. And septum piercings and nose piercings and body piercings, these are global. So you can utilize these. I personally like, for my piercing, for my septum, I don't know if you can see it, but it's hammered. And I got it specifically to look like it's Scandinavian or Celtic. Like I went specifically searching for something that looked Scandinavian or Celtic. Not to deny the other ancestries that I have, but because you see me, for the most part, you see a white girl. And I try and be as... well, I will absolutely rep and rock it. I am not going to walk down the street and have you look at me and think that I'm appropriating, right? So I definitely went for something that looked more Scandinavian or Celtic, but piercings are a global thing. And we see that even nose piercings go as far back as Neanderthals. This is something that you can utilize. Claws, teeth, these are things that you can utilize as well. You might want to go to indigenous creators to Turtle Island and buy claws or teeth from them because you can make sure that they're done in an honorable method and in an honorable way, right? Yet that connection for those animals can be still the connection to your own ancestry. Eagles are everywhere. The Neanderthals tamed golden eagles. and they hunted with them, right? So eagles are something that's a global thing. So you might get eagle talons, though I do think that eagle talons within the United States and Canada, you have to be an Indigenous member, just like the feathers, um, and which would translate to all birds of prey. And there are different things that you can utilize that might be something that you can pull forth your ancestry. Teeth, right? Deer teeth, elk teeth. These might be something that you utilize. Predator teeth might be something that you can utilize, right? Again, it is about this is work for you, right? I'm giving you ideas, but you're going to have to do the legwork. And the legwork involves where are my ancestors from, right? And then what is indigenous in that area? What's a non-invasive species in that area? And how might they have utilized that understanding and animistics framework, right? And so that's what you need, what your legwork is going to be. You have to find where your ancestry is, and then you have to find what's indigenous to that area. And then you have to decide how you're going to incorporate that into your system of connection, right? For some of us, it's language. For some of it's smoke cleansing. For some of us, it's wearing ornaments. For some of us, it's tattooing. I mean, this is Ogham. This says speak out in Irish Gaelic, and I have step up on the back of my foot, right? And these are prayer for me, right? These are life ways for me, right? And so this says it's Irish Gaelic, which I made sure was correct for Irish Gaelic, and then it's translated into Irish Gaelic, and then written in Ogham, and then tattooed. So you can do things like that. I would avoid anything on the chin region. There is no documentation or evidence of a lot of chin tattoos anywhere along the globe. Everything that I've seen in the tattooing books is a full face, including the chin. So I would avoid anything chin region, and I would definitely avoid chin lines in any way, shape, or form, just because of the fact that there are nations that are fighting for the right to utilize their traditional markings. And you should not be utilizing their traditional markings when you're not a part of that nation, right? So you can use tattooing, which is again something that's 35,000 years old in France, right? You can use ornamentation of body. You can also, as you're imbibing spirits, as you're interacting, I don't go to my altar and ask for things. That's not why my altar is there. I go to my altar and I thank, right? The few things that I have asked for, I asked for my ancestors to include Tina and her children. That's something I asked for. That is one of the very few things I ask for. I don't ask for my ancestors. I thank my ancestors. I talk to my ancestors. I ask them questions. I try and be better for them, but I don't ask them to give me things. And I think that that is something that needs to be understood on an animistic sense too, because many of us believe in God as the thought process of who we go to beg for shit. And that's not who it is. When we are looking at an animistic or an interconnectedness sense, it's not who you go to beg for your life to be better. It's who you go to thank for all the beautiful things that you do have. Your ancestors struggled and fought. It doesn't matter what part of the globe they're from, your ancestors struggled and fought. Your ancestors struggled to be recognized. Every place was colonized by Rome. Every place was colonized by Western thought, right? Of course, some of Asia wasn't, right? But there's a lot of colonization in Asia too, of different Asian groups colonizing other Asian groups, right? So almost every space that you can think of has dealt with being colonized, has dealt with being harmed. Even Rome colonized themselves. Like even Rome went out and destroyed the other Latin tribes. Even Rome went out and destroyed the other Latin tribes. So places have been colonized across the globe, and places have had their heritage and their ancestry robbed from them across the globe. So your ancestors have fought to be recognized across the globe. Not only have your ancestors fought to be recognized across the globe, but your ancestors fought for your sustainability. They, worked hard to ensure that you had food. They were a part of a community to make sure that you had stability. For you to go to them sitting in what they would recognize as wealth and abundance, right? Safety and wealth and abundance in levels that they probably didn't have, and to beg for them to give you more safety and wealth and abundance is a little bit like asking grandma for more money when she's starving, right? Like it's not appropriate. So I don't go to my ancestors and ask for things. I go to my ancestors with gratitude and love, right? And so when you're interacting, that's another thing that you should look at is, are you going with an interaction of take, or are you going with an interaction of give? You should always be reconnecting in an interaction of give. You should never be looking for what you can take, because that is not a reconnectiveness. Okay. Again, these are base thought processes and ideas for you to build on. I cannot teach you how to reconnect with your direct ancestry unless you're sitting across from me and we share ancestry. It's the only way I can teach you. Can't do it over here in a 75 person, 200 person live, right? I have to be sitting directly across from you or having a direct conversation with you, and we have to share some ancestry. And it has to be some ancestry that I know the connection of, right? Like I know how to connect to. So I cannot tell you how to do it. I can give you ideas. I can start you on your journey. I can give you a basis so that you can make your own journey, but it is absolutely a journey that you must make on your own. Right? You can get help from others, you can reconnect to others, but the decisions of that journey are your own. And how you do it is your own. And what methods of that reconnection that you utilize are your own. Okay. I'm going to turn on questions for a couple minutes, and then I'm going to go ahead. And as I turn on questions, I'm going to go ahead and start with what I usually say as I'm leaving, so that I can go ahead and get out of here and go do the other things. So as I get out of here, I like to remind everybody, biologically, we're nurturing and communal as a species. Biologically, we have what we call mandatory midwifery. We must have assistance in our childbirth because of the way our pelvis is shaped, and the way the head is shaped, and the way the shoulders are shaped. We actually turn our children twice as they come out. And I don't teach things about Indigenous community on this side. My adopted mother is Mi'kmaq. The woman who adopted me is Mi'kmaq, but I don't teach of stuff on this side, just because I don't find it appropriate. I'm not a culture keeper for any nation, right? Look for Atira, Atira, on here. She is under the people that I follow, if you're looking, and she can show you how to connect. She can help you find ways to connect to Turtle Island Indigenous nations. Atira. So biologically, we are nurturing and communal. We know Luna. Yes, that's another one. I didn't know you were in here, Luna. I think I saw you for a second earlier. Because we have mandatory midwifery. The only other species that's ever had mandatory midwifery was Neanderthal. We have to have help. We have to have community, right? And because we have to have community, absolutely, thank you. Because we have to have community to birth our children, we have to have community as well to raise our children. Our children we have 5 life stages from birth to adulthood. To the moment we're born to our full brain development is 25 years currently, and it's 5 life stages. No other species on the planet has 5 life stages. Neanderthal had 4 life stages, and no other species on the planet has the extended period of brain development that we have. We know from things like the failure to thrive studies done in the 50s and 60s that we must nurture our children. Pump, pump, dump, and walk away does not continue our species. You can't fuck a woman and walk off and expect that child to survive. You just can't. So it is not getting laid that is your biological drive. Your biological drive is to nurture your offspring from the moment they're born into the moment they're an adult. So as a community or as a species, we are nurturing. We must nurture our children through an extended period of childhood for our children to become members of our species who are able to propagate the next generation. So our propagation of species is not snakes' propagation of species. You can't just have sex and walk away. That doesn't continue our species. Biologically, we are nurturing. Biologically, we are communal. All of it is being recorded on YouTube right now. So if you go to YouTube, you can find all of my past lives and this one all recorded. You can clip anything from it that you need to. So biologically being nurturing and communal as a species, this means that we have to have that interconnectedness to survive. And we are currently living in a society that teaches us that interconnectedness is a problem, that we should not be taking care of each other, that we should be okay with children dying, that we should be okay with people sleeping on the streets. And because we live in a society that is so unhealthy, that is so antithetical to everything us as a species needs for survivability, many of us are dealing with anxiety and depression. Many of us are afraid that because we can't seem to get it in this society, that we must be the problem, because society can't be the problem, right? You are having a healthy response to an unhealthy society. You are having a healthy response to an unhealthy reality. You are not the one who is not getting it. You are, in fact, the one who is getting it. Okay. So if you are dealing with a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, a lot of feelings like you don't even know how to deal with it, right? You are not the problem. You are, in fact, part of the solution. We cannot change jack shit unless we can see that it needs to be changed. We can't fix something that's broken if it doesn't appear to be broken. If you are living in an unhealthy society, having a healthy response to that unhealthy society, you are able to see what is unhealthy. So if you are dealing with depression, if you are dealing with anxiety, if you are dealing with this feeling of disconnection, if you're dealing with this feeling of you're the problem because you can't fit, you're having a healthy response to an unhealthy society. You are, in fact, doing the right things. You are, in fact, healthy. You are, in fact, not the problem. You are who we need to continue our species as a whole. We need to make some serious changes in our society, in the way that we treat each other and the way that we deal with community, to be able to be okay as a society and to not kill our species off. We are at a point where we are killing ourselves off as a species. Absolutely. The first species to actually extinct themselves is going to be us if we continue along this pathway. What we can do about this is to decolonize and to help other people decolonize. Land back on a global scale returns tending and governance to Indigenous people. This includes things like community and reciprocity. And when we can return tending and governance on a global scale to Indigenous people and return to that thought process of community and reciprocity, we can stop the climate destruction that we are causing. We can stop this sickness within our society. We can stop what is killing us off, and we can stop the trauma that we are all feeling. Many people think that land back means get out. There is not a single Indigenous nation that I know of across the globe who thinks that land back means you need to leave. What land back means is the tending and governance of the land is returned to Indigenous communities. People who want everybody to go back where they came from are European who need to go back where they came from, right? There is no Indigenous group who wants people to go back where they came from. They just want to be able to take care of the land they belong to because they belong to that land. That land does not belong to them. And they were put there to care for it, right? So if we return tending and governance to the current Indigenous communities across the globe, because there are Indigenous communities across the globe who are both recognized by the UN and are fighting for recognition by the UN, if we return tending and governance to the Indigenous communities, we can return to what we now know of as permaculture, though it is really Indigenous agriculture, right? We can return to a state of health on our planet, and we can return to a state of health within our society because of the interconnectedness that we are lacking, that is causing these problems within us, this mental issue within us, this disconnect, this pain, this depression, this anxiety. Okay, if we can return to the communal sense that is an Indigenous nature, we can get to a space where we are not dealing with this trauma, where we're healing our globe, where we're healing our species. You recognize within yourself that is that feeling of depression, that feeling of anxiety, that feeling of pain. Okay, that is that healthy response to that unhealthy society that you yourself are feeling, that causes that recognition, that gives you the ability to help move forward. You are not the problem, you are the solution. You are not the problem, you are the solution. Because it is only by returning ourselves to a state, absolutely. It is only the altar in the bedroom, absolutely. It's only by returning ourselves to a state of positive interaction with the biome and positive interaction with each other and the natural state of ourselves that we can get to a place that we can stop climate destruction and we can stop our own mass extinction and we can live and thrive in a healthy manner. So, as you are dealing with this depression, as you're dealing with this anxiety, as you're dealing with these feelings that there is something wrong with you in a society that is sick because you can't fit into the society that is sick, I want you to give yourself grace today. Most likely, you give every other human being on this planet love and grace and do not give it to yourself. The vast majority of us are taught to see other people with compassion and grace, but we're never taught to look at ourselves with compassion and grace. You most likely would be hit by somebody and try and see why they did it, yet you will not do the same for yourself. So today, I am going to ask you to give yourself love, to give yourself grace, to give yourself compassion. You deserve it. You are worthy. Every single human being on this planet is worthy of love, is worthy of compassion, is worthy of grace. And that includes you. Give it to yourself. You deserve it. And you are worthy. This is what I ask of you today. We dealt with that a little bit today, poet. There is a lot of that going on, and we did deal with that a little bit today when we dealt with the ethnocentric, right? Um, just keep fighting, just keep being resilient, and hope that eventually, unless you're talking about which you might be. And it's the same. We just have to keep speaking, right? We have to keep standing and we have to keep speaking out. We have to keep reminding people, right? Lateral violence is a huge thing. It's a huge thing. It's something that for many of us is kind of forced upon us by white supremacist tactics, right? Lateral violence is a huge thing. The only way to combat it that I've seen is to not take part of it as much as possible and to try and shut it down with people's own words, right? You'll find that a lot of people will try and use a logic that doesn't logic. So if you can use that logic and kind of turn it back to the real logic, to the actual logic, sometimes that will help. Like I was saying earlier, you got to talk to white people like you're a white person so that they understand you. It's the same thing within lateral violence or within cross communal violence, right? You have to sometimes talk with. If I can, my biological father was here for 2 weeks or a week. I went up north with him. On the way back down, we get into this interaction. He's constantly trying to gotcha me. He's only known me for 3 years. He thinks he knows me. He knew my mother for 2 weeks, 45 fucking years ago. He thinks he knows her too. It's a weird situation. He's trying to explain to me that I'm exactly like my mother, who he doesn't even know, and he doesn't even know me. He's trying to explain this to me. He tries to use these gotchas. He uses a bunch of a series of questions, and I show in every series of questions to like the fourth question. One of the things, yes, I'm like my mother in that. Yes, one thing out of 20. I'm like my mother in this. One thing out of 20. Oh, well, you're just like her. And so I'm trying to explain, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. That's just not what it is. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. But that's just not what it is, right? So as I'm trying to explain that to him, and he's getting louder and louder because he's an old deaf man, and I'm loud anyways, but I'm also trying to be heard. He decides to tell me that I am emotional. Well, we can stop this conversation. You're just getting too upset. You're just getting too upset. Why are you so emotional about this? Why are you so dramatic about this? What's wrong? Why are you so? I'm not. I'm talking to you calmly. I'm not yelling any more than the fact that my voice is raised because you're half deaf. I'm not angry. I'm not cussing. I'm not shaking. I'm not. Why do you think I'm upset? Well, your body language and your tone of voice, you're upset. You're upset. I'm not. I'm not. And I kept trying to tell him I'm not upset, but he wasn't listening because he's an old white dude. And he thinks that, and so, um, uh, globally mixed. I'm globally mixed. My indigeneities and my upbringings, my indigeneity ancestral includes Turtle Island. My upbringing was Turtle Island. Um, so I turned that back around. Why are you so upset? I'm not upset. But you seem upset. Oh, I'm not upset. But you're acting upset. No, 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 no. Your tone of voice has changed and your body movements have changed. Are you upset? I'm not upset. But you're upset. And he's like, well, we just need to end this conversation. Okay, we can end this conversation. Whoa, whoa, whoa. No, you said end this conversation. Whoa, whoa, whoa. No, you said end this conversation. We either end this conversation or we continue to argue and I'll argue back. Right? So you can take what they're using and flip it. And a lot of times when you're dealing with people, that's the only way you get them to hear. Whether it's dealing with white people and you have to talk white so that they hear you, or dealing with lateral violence and you're dealing with people who are indoctrinated into the white supremacist thought process and culture, or dealing with cross-cultural violence. A lot of times, the only way that you can get people to hear you is to use their own phrasings, their own words, and their own thought processes to listen. Because they can hear those words, they're using those words. They can understand those words, they're using those words. So if you take it and you flip it to them, right? And I don't mean like turn it back around on them, but what I mean is use their own thought processes to show why this isn't okay, right? Why this isn't why that's not okay for them to do. My father could see when it's Turtle Island. Yeah. Well, some like for a while I was using Turtle Islands or Turtle Island and Southern Turtle Island because I could not pronounce Abya, and that might be where some people are saying Turtle Islands. But for my father, he couldn't understand that I recognized that he was trying to silence me by calling me upset until I started calling him upset. And then he recognized that it was silencing him. And then he could go, oh shit, okay, okay. Right. And so, not that it improved his disposition in any way, shape, or form, but some people can't recognize it until it's their own thing. Right. Just like people can't recognize stuff until you speak their own language. Some people can't recognize it until you speak their own language. So if you're dealing with that, it is something where you can, if you're dealing with lateral violence, if you're dealing with cross-cultural lateral violence, like different marginalized community lateral violence, if you're dealing with erasure, if you're dealing with things like that, a lot of times you can use somebody's own logic to show them where that logic doesn't logic, right? Right. And so that would be the best recommendation I have on that one, right? It's kind of what I was trying to do today when I was dealing with the person who was ethnocentric within the live, to use, the reality of the situation in a way that could be understood, right? My indigeneities, literally, there's not a place on the planet that I don't have connection to. For Turtle Island and Abya, I have Turtle Island Indigenous connection and Abyalian Indigenous connection. I was raised within Turtle Island Indigenous culture in the Pacific Northwest. That is not the nations that my ancestry is from, though. So that's a way to kind of to stop that erasure or to stop that lateral violence. And sometimes it will also get you to the point that you can actually I know people from that area, get people to maybe see why the lateral violence isn't a good thing too, right? Because that lateral violence, that cross cultural violence within marginalized communities, that's really keeping us down, right? If we could ally together, if we could work together, we could stop the shit going on, right? So Turtle Island is a phrase that is used across or by many nations on the eastern seaboard. I don't know of nations on the western seaboard that use it. I know of I know personally I could name like 3 or 4 nations, but I think it's like about 10 different nations on the Eastern Seaboard. It's become one of those things that is kind of um, used by more nations than originally used it. Like the dream catcher is traditionally Ojibwe, but many people use it, and the jingle dress is traditionally from a singular culture, but many people use it. It's one of those things that's kind of become a little bit of a cross-cultural usage, or a cross, not culture, but a cross-nation usage. And so I use it because I know that there are about 5 different terms that are utilized for North America. I do not know all of them. I know that there's about 5 or 6 terms that are utilized for South America. It took me a long time to learn how to pronounce Abayala correctly. And so that's the one that I utilize. I don't care if I pronounce English correctly. It's a bastardized language made up of about 10 different languages. I do care if I pronounce indigenous languages correctly. So I use Turtle Island because the other North American ones have not necessarily been translated or not necessarily as widely used. And so I can actually use that phrasing, which is a widely used phrasing, and not worry about mispronouncing an indigenous language. And then it literally took me probably 9 months of hearing and seeing Abya before I could actually say it in comfort and not worry that I was going to actually get it wrong. And so I was able to start using Abya. Until I was able to start using Abya, I would state Turtle Islands, or Southern Turtle Island and Northern Turtle Island, just because of the fact that I was trying to ensure that I was uh, part of reclamation is utilizing indigenous words and terms for space, right? Absolutely. Have a great one, poet. And so I was trying to make sure that that reclamation was there without speaking wrong, without mispronunciation. I'm going to go ahead and go as I leave. Remember, 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 just by breathing, you are worthy and you are loved. You are worthy of love. Give yourself grace and love and compassion today. The depression and the anxiety that you feel is a healthy response to an unhealthy society. And it is that recognition and that feeling that gives us the ability to move forward and to make a better space so that we don't kill ourselves off and so that we're not destroying the planet, causing planet destruction. I mean, she's going to be here long after we're gone, but still, so that we're not hurting her. So, with all of that, I just want you to make sure that you are giving yourself grace and love today. You are worthy, you are necessary, you are needed. Please remember that. I know so many people are feeling it. This is Tom Borkland's artwork of a Gravatian man who is a European. These are the first people in Europe without the Neanderthals there. We all were black at one point. We all started in Africa at one point. Just, have much love. Take care of yourself. I will be back probably tomorrow. Bye, YouTube. So much love to you. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you soon.